Welcome to the Decennial Show, extra reviews, silly redrawn maps of Africa, featuring my co-star, Mr. Bowling Ball. Say hello to the audience, Mr. Bowling Ball. Alright, now let's get into some epic maps. Ooh, very wiggly borders. Looks like a lot of already existing countries stick around too. Great work. Now this one's pretty daring. There are many small countries and there's even an exclave. Love the enthusiasm. Get it away from me! Nobody likes you. So about a year and a half ago, I posted the second video that I ever made for this channel in which I redrew the borders of Africa, and it's still my most viewed one. But not only that, it's also my most controversial one. Although the like to dislike ratio is only 95%, so it's not the end of the world. But it's controversial for good reasons. The borders I drew were based on ethnic, linguistic and religious lines, trying to group together people whose cultures were similar to each other. I intended it to be a fun, creative exercise, but I made a really stupid mistake in the making of this video, which is that the title looks like this and the thumbnail looks like this. In trying to make both of those very clickable, I made it seem as if these borders were serious business, as if I genuinely believed that these borders were going to fix Africa. And while I did mention that it was just for fun near the end of the video, I still made a lot of people upset, and for that, I apologize. Take me out of the kitchen, I am not cooking. So now, this video exists to give some arguments as to why Africa's borders don't actually suck. Since I didn't explain the title very well last time, I'd like to clear up what I mean by fine right away. So fine doesn't mean good. I'm not here to justify the borders that the colonial powers drew. I hate the straight lines, they should be gay lines instead. What I mean by fine is that redrawing the African borders today would ruin the progress that a lot of African countries have already made. Progress that people sometimes deny exists. Ivory talked about that denial in two very influential papers published in 1991 and 1995 about development in the Third World. In the 1991 paper, he explains how specific narratives about development have to be made more simple to communicate them better to policymakers. Because of that, people need to create better, more accurate narratives so that development policies can be as effective as possible. In the 1995 paper, he takes this idea and applies it to Africa, where he complains about articles that create narratives saying that Africa is always an exception when it comes to development, as if Africa only gets worse. He says that narratives like that aren't helpful because they don't inform policymakers enough to create effective policies. So, if crisis narratives in development are harmful, does the same apply to crisis narratives about diversity? Well, yeah, I think so at least, and I'd like to prove it with statistics from the Afrobarometer. The Afrobarometer is a non-profit company with its headquarters in Ghana. It conducts face-to-face interviews with African citizens about democracy, the environment, security, that sort of stuff. Its datasets are published online, and they also publish articles with cool graphs to communicate the information they've gathered. And I would like to go over those about unity regarding ethnicity, language, and religion, since that's what I based the map on. I'll show you the results of their around 8 surveys conducted between 2019 and 2021, since I don't think the round 9 survey summary has been published yet. Across the 34 African countries surveyed, only 14% of people believe that other people can be trusted. Not a great start, but 68% of people do believe that more diverse communities make for stronger communities. A whopping 90% of people wouldn't mind or would like having a neighbor with a different ethnicity than them, which is 87% for different religions, 85% for different parties, and 82% for foreigners, although the tolerance for homosexuals is unfortunately quite low. 65% of people think there's more that unites their country rather than divides them. 85% of people put their national identity above their ethnic one or think they're both equally important, ignoring Tunisia and Sudan where this question was not asked. People who aren't comfortable with their ethnic identity in public are generally low, with only 7% not wanting to speak their mother tongue in public, and 10% don't want to wear traditional dresses in public. People who feel discriminated against by other citizens for their ethnicity is 21% and 18% for religion. It seems that economic status has a larger impact on who gets discriminated, and governments discriminate more than other citizens. People who are more tolerant of others are more involved in their community than intolerant people. And those who have faced discrimination get involved in their communities to make changes, more often than people who haven't been discriminated against. Okay, yeah, I'm just throwing a bunch of numbers in your face, but I think you get the point I'm trying to make here. Many Africans are very tolerant despite their colonial borders making them share a country. And just like with Emery trying to get rid of crisis narratives regarding African development, I'd like to get rid of crisis narratives regarding Africa's borders. Because in my opinion, while Africa's borders often get the blame for why conflicts exist in Africa, I don't think they're specifically the cause of those conflicts. There are a myriad of other reasons why conflicts manifest on the borders. So Africa's borders aren't good, but they also aren't bad. They're fine. Africa's borders are fine, actually. This video will be split up into 5 different sections. Again, since I made this map based on ethnicity, language, and religion, the first 3 sections will discuss African conflicts of those natures. The 4th will be about the African Union, and I'll keep the 5th one as a surprise for later. Don't just look ahead on the chapter list, we're working on building an honor system here. I'm gonna sprinkle in my own thoughts as well based on what I've read, but if you think I've jumped to conclusions like an idiot, then let me know in the comments. I'm not a professional, and since I'm not African myself, I haven't experienced what Africans have after all. Here are some trigger warnings for each individual chapter. I'm not gonna show anything graphic, but these topics will be discussed, so you should skip some if you have to. Now enjoy the next 30 minutes of me babbling on and on about Africa. At least I hope it's 30 minutes. I didn't go too far over that threshold, right? Right? Off the coast of Madagascar, you can find 3 independent island countries: Mauritius, Seychelles, and the Comoros. Yeah, the first countries I'm talking about aren't even on the continent itself. But I find it interesting to compare them, because despite them being so similar geographically, all being island countries in East Africa, they're very unique in terms of ethnicity. I'll start off with Mauritius. The island of Mauritius had no indigenous population before it was colonized, meaning that its first inhabitants were East African and Malagasy slaves that France brought over. The British later kicked out the French, abolished slavery, and instead brought over indentured laborers from India, both Hindus and Muslims. A small community of Chinese traders also settled on the island. The result of this today is a very diverse population, consisting of Indian Hindus, Indian Muslims, Africans, Chinese, a small French economic elite, and various mixed citizens like Creoles. Mauritius is a place where ethnic and religious identities have always been very important, so intermarriage actually isn't very common, but it is more common on the Seychelles. Seychelles is pretty similar to Mauritius. The archipelago also did not have an indigenous population before the French came along and also brought over African slaves. The main difference with Mauritius is that when the British took over, they did not settle the islands themselves. So the only settlers remained French, African, and Creole. So it's also a diverse country, though not as diverse as Mauritius. The Comoros, however, is where our story changes quite drastically. It had already been settled by Africans and Southeast Asians since the 6th century. Because of this, the Comoros has had a dominant single language, single religion, Sunni Islam, and arguably a single ethnicity despite some differing African, Arab, Austronesian ancestries. So now that I've given you some background info, I'd like to ask you a question. Which of these 3 is the most stable, and which is the least stable? In other words, which one do you feel is the safest to spend your next winter lounging on the beach on? If I had to guess, your first instinct would be to say that the Comoros is the most stable of the 3, because it's the least diverse, so surely that leads to less conflict, right? But you're also probably thinking that me even asking this question means that this is a trick question, and that the Comoros is not the correct answer. And if you were thinking that, then you'd be right. Mauritius is the most stable. Taking a quick look at the 2023 Fragile States Index, Mauritius is labeled under very stable, above countries like Estonia, Czechia, and the UK. Seychelles is labeled under stable, right around the likes of Romania, Malaysia, and Greece. And where can you find the Comoros? Yikes, a high warning country close to Bangladesh, Russia, and Iran. But let's give the Comoros the benefit of the doubt, since correlation does not equal causation. I can't just use this information to say that a higher diversity leads to more stability, and indeed that's not necessarily true. So instead, let's do some more research and figure out why the Comoros rank so low. Saying that the Comoros wasn't settled by any colonial power isn't entirely correct. More specifically, France only settled one island of the Comoro archipelago, the southernmost one, because it was seen as the most valuable. The colonial boundaries that France set between the islands were strict, like any other colonial boundary. So when the Comoro Islands were set to become independent, France recorded separate results for each island in the independence referendum. And as you can probably see coming, the 3 other islands chose to become independent, while the southernmost one chose to stay with France. Partial independence like that is now allowed by 3 different declarations on decolonization by the UN and the Organization of African Unity. But did France care? Well no, what were they gonna do about it? It's the island that we now call Mayotte. Since 2011, it's been an overseas department of France. Its citizens are French, they are represented in French institutions, and public life on Mayotte is very similar to public life in France. And if someone doesn't like that, then they get vetoed. And this is important because it set a precedent. It let the world know that the decolonized countries weren't natural. Their borders only exist because they happened to be the status quo when they became independent. If the status quo was different, things could have gone in any way imaginable. The Comoros could have been a part of Madagascar, for example. Or more importantly, all 4 of the Comoro Islands could have gone their own separate ways. And that is exactly what the island of Anjouan thought. Anjouan experienced a large decline in agricultural exports in the 90s, and the government of the Comoros wasn't able to make up for the loss of income. At the same time, the main island of Grand Comore got money from remittances, money sent back from Comorians who lived abroad, money that Anjouan desperately needed to stay afloat. Combine that with 20 coups d'etats and a precedent that was set by Mayotte earlier, and Anjouan declared their secession from the Comoros, asking to be reintegrated into its former colonial master. For France, this was embarrassing. They quickly rejected Anjouan's integration. After some fighting, the Comoros reunited in 2001, but Anjouan's institutions were left in total chaos, and it had to be invaded again in 2008 with African Union support. Before I start comparing the three island nations again, I'll admit that the separatist movement was probably more likely to happen in the Comoros rather than in Mauritius. The Comoros is an archipelago, while Mauritius mainly consists of one island. Islands being occupied by two countries are rare, especially for one as small as Mauritius. So admittedly, there's not a lot of space for separatist movements on Mauritius. Discrimination is also pretty common on Mauritius as proven by the Afrobarometer, so I'll concede on that front as well. But still, why did the most ethnically, religiously, and linguistically unified country of the three experience a separatist movement? Especially since all three of these are island countries in similar locations with relatively similar sizes and populations. So that's why I think that modern civil wars and separatist movements don't occur because of ethnic differences, but because of the state not giving people resources. Mauritius encourages coalitions in its political system, aided by multi-member districts to represent the population matter. Most people identify with their ethnic group and with the nation equally, preferring a dual identity. Seychelles has been stable, but its democratic principles are fairly weak, only recently seeing their first truly peaceful transfer of power between two different parties in 2020. The Comoros, on the other hand, has always struggled with both stability and democracy, which is partly due to the conflict with France over Mayotte, but also because the Comorian government generally didn't provide services for its people. It had bad hospitals, unpaid teachers, bad roads, a lack of water, electricity, and buildings. This might sound silly, but at that point, how could Comorians have even known that the Comorian government exists? How could the state have had any authority over its people if it doesn't do state things? Those who are in contact with the state, though, often know someone who works there personally and can ask them for benefits. Some call that neo-patrimonialism, but I'll get back into that when we discuss Kenya. So Anjouan didn't secede because they were culturally different from the rest of the Comoros, but because Anjouan wanted to control its economy by itself. It led to Anjouan overemphasizing their cultural differences with the other islands to justify their secession. In countries with ethnically or religiously homogeneous populations, cleavages can still be handcrafted based on ideology, personality, or geography. And that's what I think leads to violence. If the state is corrupt or doesn't provide a group with services or some autonomy, then that leaves secession as the most desirable thing to do. So that's why I think cultural or ethnic differences don't lead to secessionism in Africa, or secessionism in general. It's just that those differences are used as a rallying cry to get people to want to secede. In some cases, those differences exist, and in some they're less prevalent but still used. It doesn't really matter either way. Instead, the cause of those ethnic conflicts could be a lack of a justice system, a bad electoral system, sometimes it's bad leadership, or a lack of grassroots institutions. Whatever it is, it's not ethnic hatred, whatever that even means. So how does this relate back to the map? Well, I see the experiences of the Comoros as a cautionary tale. Even if the borders that I drew were adopted, even if these countries are culturally similar, it would all be for nothing if the state doesn't or can't provide a group of people with basic life necessities. That group of people won't think, oh yeah, the government consists of people who speak the same language as us, that's so awesome. No, they're gonna think, I'm going to die of dehydration, please give me water. Or something like that, you get what I mean. And now that Mauritius, Seychelles, and the Comoros have set a framework, I'd like to give you a couple more examples of why ethnic diversity is good, actually, and why having ethnically homogeneous countries, such as the ones on this map, doesn't automatically lead to stability. Or when the example country is ethnically diverse, then I'd like to argue why I think that diversity wasn't the cause of the conflict, but like I said, the rallying cry. I'll start with one that people are probably expecting me to talk about because the country where I live is definitely responsible for what happened to it. Okay, yeah, you probably already know what we're going to be discussing in this chapter, but I don't want to say that word on YouTube, so I'm just going to call it the Geno. You know, the Genocide. You know what I'm talking about? So the Rwandan Geno happened in 1994, in which the Hutu population, making up about 85% of Rwanda, murdered many of the 14% Tutsi population after decades of tension between the two ethnic groups. Moderate Hutus thought that the killings were a bad idea, and so they were killed as well. And this was kind of weird. I mean, yeah, obviously killing anyone is automatically weird, but what I mean is that the two ethnic groups I just described, Hutu and Tutsi, are kind of almost one ethnic group. Definitely not as close as the Comoros as people, but they have many similarities. You can't distinguish them very easily based on their language or their bodies. The two groups also married with each other a lot. Establishing alliances between them was simply economically beneficial after all. So why did these two very similar groups of people get into conflict, and why do we think of them as mostly separate ethnicities today? Well, remember how Anjouan overemphasized cultural differences to justify their secession? Usually it's not the natives of the country themselves, but the colonizer who makes those cultural distinctions. And in Rwanda's case, you can blame German and Belgian colonizers. The Tutsi minority were already the ruling class in Rwanda before colonization. So when colonizers came along, they put the Tutsi up on a pedestal, claiming that they were superior to the majority Hutu and 1% Twa. School students were taught that there was a hierarchy between them, creating not only an ethnic divide, but a class divide between Tutsis and Hutus as well. And while non-elites were more so worried about political issues rather than racial ones, elites who got such education projected their racial assumptions onto those issues. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't any differences between Hutus and Tutsis, their ethnic identities definitely existed. Rather, Belgian colonizers took these differences and made them much more politically important, driving a huge wedge between Hutu and Tutsi elites. Similarly to the Comoros, despite the countries being mostly united ethnically, violence still broke out due to government mismanagement, in this case an intentional divide and rule strategy. So where does that bring Rwanda today? Well, Rwanda is actually trying to get rid of the memory of the Geno by getting rid of the narrative that there even are ethnic differences between Hutus and Tutsis. Like I mentioned in the Ivory flag video, Rwanda changed its flag and also its anthem to promote reconciliation and to define all Rwandans as one people. I appreciate the Rwandan government for trying to make amends, but admittedly I don't think this is the best strategy. There's a bit of a conflict of memory going on among Rwandans who can't agree on what they should remember and what they should forget, with disagreements mainly being between Hutus and Tutsis. Should only the Tutsi victims be remembered, or also the moderate Hutus who died trying to stop the killings? Despite the government's wishes, Rwandans can't help but remember what happened, and personally I don't blame them. But unfortunately now there's still violence against mixed Hutu Tutsis. Citizens blame top-down governance for what happened, claiming that the people were already living together peacefully before the Geno happened. The KKK courts were made to hold people responsible for killings and give victims closure, but they were often used for personal revenge. Simply put, Rwandans don't want to forgive and forget. In trying to get rid of ethnic identity, Rwanda ironically only made it more prominent. It might take a couple generations before Rwandans are ready to accept forgiving and forgetting. So, is there anything else that can be done about this? Well, we can't really prove what would work until Rwanda tries something else and it ends up working out. But I think there's another country that can give Rwanda an idea as to what to do next. Burundi is no peaceful country by any means. It went through a very similar violent conflict as Rwanda. But despite that, I do think that Burundi at least did one thing better than Rwanda after the civil war. Burundi started conscripting its soldiers based on a quota system, meaning that the armed forces needed to conscript at least a certain number of Hutus and Tutsis. It was suggested to them by South African policymakers who also use a sort of quota-based integration. Sami found that this system reduced ethnic prejudice, made people care less about their ethnic identity, and as a result, the armed forces were less biased in who they protected and who they were violent against. There was just less ethnic favoritism. Would that help Rwanda as well? Maybe, I'm not sure. But this is why I personally think that neither forgiving nor forgetting is the best strategy for Rwanda to apply. Rather, I believe that to acknowledge is a better one. Meaningful and consistent interactions between survivors can help them cope with the trauma. So it's best to acknowledge what happened and take steps to ensure that it never happens again. Because not acting can lead to violence all over again. But Rwanda unfortunately has made other mistakes which they don't really acknowledge either. After the Rwandan Geno, mostly Hutus fled the country towards the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or Zaire as it was known then. Hutus feared being punished by the new Tutsi regime that took power in Rwanda, and started recruiting and rearming people to invade Rwanda and install a Hutu regime. Both sides have thus consistently intervened in the eastern Congo, which massively destabilized the region. Most notably in the First Congo War, right after the Rwandan Geno ended, which saw a coalition of a bunch of African countries overthrow the dictator in the DRC. After withdrawing from the region in 2002, Rwanda has refused to discuss its invasion. We can make assumptions as to what their interests were, like potential security or economic interests, but you won't hear it straight from the source. It only gave Rwanda more blood on its hands, this time from the native Congolese and Kivu populations who suffered under the violence. I think they should acknowledge that as well. That concludes everything that I wanted to talk about regarding Rwanda, but the impact of their actions remains visible in the DR Congo. Similarly to Rwanda and Burundi, it's a country where Belgium also used a sort of divide and rule strategy. The region of Katanga in the southeast largely had its own state powers, like being able to raise its own police force, and Belgian settlers there attempted to make the region more autonomous to subvert the power of Leopoldville. They were given all of this because of their vast mineral wealth. But the rest of the colony often didn't benefit from that wealth, because Katanga was economically more connected to southern Africa through railroads. The Kazailuba were also given special status because they lived within smaller chieftains, making them more open to Christian missionaries and migrant labor, so many of them worked in Katanga's mines. In the end, Katanga looked nothing like the rest of the Congo. It had mostly mining towns with European-looking miners' families, as well as actual Europeans often settling in the towns. It had 75% of the Congo's mineral production, and 50% of the Congo's overall income came from Katanga. In the end, Katanga did indeed declare independence from the Congo with Belgian support, as did South Kasai, though it was more vulnerable and without Belgian support. The subsequent Congo crisis became a battleground for the Cold War, and Belgium eventually agreed to reintegrate Katanga into the Congo after UN and US pressure, but them having killed the Congo's president, Lumumba, left the country in poor shape regardless. The dictator Rwanda was trying to depose in the First Congo War, Mobutu, gained the power here, and starting from 1970, faced with a large economic crisis, he arrested many army officers based on their ethnicity because he feared they would dissent. He instead replaced them with officers of his own Equateur region. So yeah, that was a long paragraph to basically say two things. 1. Katanga and South Kasai declared independence not due to ethnic differences, but colonial divide and rule. And 2. Dictators often intentionally make their own ethnic group the dominant one in the armed forces to exercise control. That second one actually has a name. Ethnic stacking. And there's one African country that I think is a good example of that phenomenon, so we can discuss it further. In most definitions, ethnic stacking happens when the leader of a regime and their military have a network of patronage between them because the regime leader fills the army with officers of their own ethnic group, or otherwise disarmed the actual army and created their own military institution filled with co-ethnics. Let me guess, this is a terrible idea? Yeah, Harkness has proven that ethnic stacking, despite officers previously being ethnically diverse, has a high chance of leading to a coup d'etat. Because when elections result in someone of a different ethnic group becoming the leader, the ethnically stacked army seizes power right after. This leads to insurgencies, civil wars, you get the idea. For example, in 2019, the military toppled Sudan's almost 30-year-long dictator in response to peaceful protests. The people in the army who were most willing to crack down on the protesters, however, were high-ranking Arab militias, which supports the idea that Sudan also did some ethnic stacking of its own with the purpose of getting rid of opponents to the regime. Opponents that Sudan has a lot of. Sudan's Arabization and Islamization process since its independence has led to many mutinies in the majority African communities in the south. The southern peoples also often fought each other due to Britain's earlier divide and rule strategy. Yes, this pattern keeps going, you get the gist. But ethnic stacking wasn't practiced yet in Sudan up until the 80s, in order to tackle the Southern People's Liberation Army, or SPLA, during the Second Sudanese Civil War. However, Sudan still meddled with the military during the First Sudanese Civil War by forming local militias, arming them so that they could defend themselves against insurgencies in the south, amplifying the cleavages that Britain had already made. Encouraging infighting was a key strategy for Sudan to delegitimize its insurgencies. This approach wasn't limited to southern Sudan. The Western Darfur also suffered under the Arabization policy of the 80s, especially when Arabs started replacing Africans in Darfur's civil services. The civil war in Chad also spilled over into Darfur, where the Chadian and Sudanese Arabs seized land from the Fur and Masalit Africans. Sudan even distributed arms to the Chadian Arabs to suppress the conflict over land between them and the Africans in Darfur. And as the Second Sudanese Civil War drew to a close, the war in Darfur began in 2003, which saw Sudanese militias commit atrocities against black African agricultural groups in the region. The main perpetrators of those atrocities were the Janjaweed, which were Arabs from Chad and Darfur who Sudan tasked with suppressing the rebellion. In 2004, the US launched an investigation and concluded that yes, there was a general going on. And so the US then repeatedly pressured the AU, UN and Sudan to send peacekeeping forces. Sudan was only able to stall until 2007 before giving in to the demands. The peace talks between 2004 and 2007 were a big ol' mess that I'll go over later. But thankfully the peace deal that ended the war in Darfur in 2020, known as the Yuba Agreement, was actually pretty solid overall. It had a lot of actors, a large geographical scope, its terms are important, and it recognizes Sudan's cultural, linguistic and religious diversity. It promised to reduce economic imbalances, provide basic services and infrastructure, and allow some fiscal decentralization. Unfortunately, its main problem is that those words aren't often backed up by actions, since the terms aren't implemented much. Sudan simply doesn't have the finances or institutions to do so, and needs development aid from others. Plus, despite those protests in 2019 I mentioned earlier finally leading to Sudan's dictator getting deposed, there have been a lot of bumps in the road to Sudan's democracy. Sudan's armed forces launched a coup of the country in 2021, due to loyalists of the dictatorial regime wanting to restore military rule. Wow, I haven't heard that before. But that's not all. Even more recently in 2023, the Sudanese armed forces came into conflict with the paramilitary group the Rapid Support Forces, plunging Sudan into an entirely new conflict. And that is pretty ironic, because do you know who the Rapid Support Forces are? They're Janjaweed. They're the offshoot of the exact group that the Sudanese armed forces supported to suppress the conflict in Darfur. The Janjaweed, now RSF, has become too entrenched in Sudan's military system. There's not really a boundary anymore between a paramilitary group and the official enforcers of the law, so the RSF just enforces its own law. Wow, the Sudanese armed forces really shot themselves in the foot there. But there's been a large elephant in this room that I've been consistently ignoring. I think it's about time we discuss South Sudan. Sudan's human rights abuses in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains were in a morbid way beneficial to the SPLA and SPLM, the party of the SPLA, because it put so much international pressure on Sudan, forcing them to accept Southern Sudan's self-determination. So in 2011, the mandated referendum was held which gave independence to South Sudan. But sadly, this doesn't mean that South Sudan is now a much better country to live in. While the people likely did support independence, they didn't necessarily support the SPLA army or SPLM government. And that's pretty bad when South Sudan's government, its national army, and the SPLM are almost interchangeable. The SPLM practically leading the country means that South Sudan is still violent without needing Sudan as an enemy. Most notably, in 2013, the president dismissed most members of his cabinet to replace them with more loyal ones. Great. When many SPLM members protested against this, they were violently suppressed by the government. And so began a civil war between the SPLM and the SPLM in opposition. They didn't have a budget to come up with a better name. And even though this conflict was basically infighting in the SPLM, they framed the conflict as an ethnic war between the Dinka peoples and the Nuer peoples. It's framed that way because the government is mostly Dinka and the opposition is mostly Nuer. But interpreting the conflict as a war between two ethnic groups isn't very helpful. It ignores all of the other opposition groups to the government, and a large number of these peoples who aren't violent at all. Rather, centralization and the absence of services are again key issues. Due to this misunderstanding, the international effort to make peace in 2015 mandated that the two parties would share power in the government. Seems like a reasonable solution if you think of the conflict as one between two parties or two ethnic groups, but obviously it didn't work because it was based off of a misunderstanding. There's still violence in South Sudan in one way or another. It's why the South Sudanese don't at all believe that having those two groups share power would solve anything. So to conclude, ethnic stacking, or filling your army with officers of the same ethnicity as the leader, is eventually going to lead to conflict in some way or another. A diverse country should naturally have a diverse army. But why leave it at the army? Governments can manipulate the structure of many more institutions to include more co-ethnics. Here's some others. You can't call these next examples ethnic stacking because that's reserved for the military, but filling other institutions with co-ethnics can also lead to problems. Uganda, for example, has always tried to have just co-ethnics in its police force. In fact, when its dictator changed in 1986, the ethnic groups that got stacked reversed, going from Nilotic to Bantu. But the police is a security apparatus that wants to gather information from citizens to prevent and solve crimes, as opposed to the army. So unfortunately for Uganda, Ugandans aren't going to work together with the police whom they distrust because the president ethnically stacked it. They'd rather work with an officer who is of the same ethnic group as them. This makes working together in multi-ethnic communities pretty difficult. So yeah, not too different from the military, but as an institution that interacts more with the public, its being ethnically stacked can lead to even more distrust, unfortunately. Ethnicity can also be used to maintain power in elections. One example is when Zambia's president was set to lose the 2006 elections until he presented his party as a non-tribal actor to contrast with his rival party and to get votes from the more marginalized western regions. So ethnicity might change how politicians act during elections. But unfortunately, you can imagine that elections with ethnic voting aren't always a peaceful process like the one I just described. Like in 2007 when Kenya's elections faced unprecedented levels of ethnic violence. And whose fault is that? Well, the British, because of course it is. When Kenya was a colony, the British only allowed political parties that didn't expand outside of the district it began in until 1960, leading to parties which only really consisted of one ethnic group, which remained the same when those parties were allowed to run in national elections. After independence, Kenya became a one-party regime, which survived until 2002 through patron-client networks, meaning that the leaders of ethnic groups got more access to state resources. The term patron-client network reminds me of another term known as neo-patrimonialism, which is something I dropped earlier when talking about the Comoros. It's when a state or party provides resources to a specific group to get their loyalty. But keep in mind that at times the term oversimplifies things too much, and it can't predict what's going to happen in some African countries that use it. It can be used to give some context to some African ethnic conflicts though, like this one in Kenya. Multi-party elections were allowed in 1991, but just like before independence, parties were formed based on ethnicity, and so voting based on ethnicity became commonplace, and thus also violence to deter people from voting for certain parties. But at this point, you already know that I want to argue why ethnic differences were not the cause of the 2007 Kenyan electoral violence. There being little evidence for discrimination against non-co-ethnics in some parts of Nairobi that were hotbeds of violence in 2007 is a start, but I also think that way because Kenya's politicians still needed the support of smaller ethnic groups. You see, there's a difference between mobilization and persuasion when it comes to elections. Mobilization is taking an area that you know will vote for you and trying to increase the turnout there. Persuasion, on the other hand, is going to an area that could go either way and trying to get the people there who are already going to vote for you. In the 2007 Kenyan elections, there was a lot more persuasion than mobilization. The major parties put effort into getting the smaller ethnic groups to vote for them. They weren't just trying to get a majority of votes by getting their own ethnic group to go and vote. And this is also beneficial for those smaller ethnic groups. It's their main way to get access to state services after all. Children in Kenya are more likely to attend primary school and finish it if the president is part of the same ethnic group as a child. Same goes for attending secondary education, though not finishing it. Kenyan judges are also more likely to grant appeals to someone if they are of the same ethnic group as the judge. That's why each ethnic group wants to vote for their own ethnic group, or the one of the larger ethnic group who promised them all those services using neo-patrimonialism, because they know that the party will give them all those favors, even if it is to a smaller extent. Ethnic voting becomes almost a necessity in that case. I don't think Kenyans care about who their leader is, they care about getting the provisions they need to survive. To repeat what I said about the Comoros, that group of people won't think, oh yeah, the government consists of people who speak the same language as us, that's so awesome. No, they're gonna think, I'm going to die of dehydration, please give me water. That's why some groups try to deter people from voting for parties who weren't gonna give them state services, unfortunately with violence. This need for state services is also important in other African countries. South Africans, Kenyans, Ugandans and Tanzanians are, for example, more likely to pay taxes if they're satisfied with the public provisions they get. The provisions they want differ, but people in these countries are all more compliant if their needs are met. For another example, in Ghana, there are also a lot of ethnic groups. But if a voter is part of a smaller ethnic group living in a region where the majority of people are of another ethnic group, then that voter tends to vote for the party of the majority ethnic group of their region. When that party is in power, they're going to give more services to the region where they live, because that's where their co-ethnics are. And so the voter of the minority group also gets to profit off of it. So ethnicity isn't a great predictor of a vote, locality is, because that's where the resources go. It just so happens that most ethnic groups are also geographically in the same area. Duh. I mean, otherwise this silly map would look a lot more ridiculous. Anyways, about what I just said about Ghana, that's an example of two ethnic groups not being very geographically separated, and I believe that geographic separation also has an influence on how people perceive other cultures. Malawi, for example, is administratively divided between the north, center, and south, and each of these has a dominant tribe. These ethnic groups being so geographically separated leads to more mistrust between them than if they were more integrated nationally. Uganda has taken geographic separation a step further. In 2016, it gave a lot of ethnic groups special political representation, meaning that they got their own separate kingdoms within Uganda. But this only increased ethnic conflict, and the president basically only did it for patronage. It's divide and rule again. But let's take geographic separation another step further, because pretending that ethnic groups have a certain territory that they should call home isn't new, and has proven to lead to conflict on the national level as well. Case in point, I think the Horn of Africa is a place where I messed up quite a bit when drawing the map. First of all, as many comments pointed out to me, the Adal Emirate was ethnically Somalian, not Oromo, which are the people who live in this area. So calling this country Adal is a frankly embarrassing mistake. I should have just called it Oromia, my bad completely. But what I also did wrong was the poor judgment of making Somalia this big. While yes, these areas are all filled with ethnic Somalis, so according to my criteria for this map, these borders make sense, Somalia's relationship with these lands outside of its borders represent a huge trauma for people living in this area that I should have accounted for. When Somalia became independent in 1960, uniting the British and Italian colonies, there were already thoughts about uniting all Somalis into one country, including those in Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Kenya. Somalis living in Ethiopia, mostly in the Ogaden region, visited Somalia for trade or education and came under the influence of that idea of unification. And so Ethiopia and Somalia started seeing each other as their primary threats. A military government took over Ethiopia in 1975, and Somalia began training separatist rebel groups in Ogaden and Oromia, with the justification being Ethiopia's new government stirring their nationalism. What followed was 2 to 3 years of guerrilla warfare with Ethiopia, until Somalia's army fully intervened, starting the Ogaden War of 1977 and 1978. Somalis in Ethiopia mostly welcomed the invading Somali forces, but many of them fled to Somalia as Ethiopia took the region back. Somalia lost in the end, and Ethiopia remained busy expelling 1 billion different insurgent groups afterwards. Ogaden remained under this harsh military rule until Ethiopia's military government collapsed in 1991. It's safe to say that Somalia never recovered from this loss. Since the war ended, Somalia has been in a decades-long civil war and hasn't been able to deliver basic services like justice, healthcare, or education to its people. On the Fragile States Index, it ranks the highest, so high that it gets its own tier of very high alert. Since the downfall of the dictatorship in 1991, insurgents and counterinsurgents were the one to fill in the gaps for Somalia's lack of services by establishing their own authority in their respective regions. The insurgents are often led by different Somali clans, which provide security to their members, which unfortunately comes at the cost of minority clans not being able to provide their people with security and are thus often victims of violence. They are also more likely to experience famines. For example, people from the Rahan Wayne clan and the Bantu Somalis were the vast majority of victims of famine during the early 90s and early 2010s drought, because they're marginalized and so receive less food aid from the government. Major clans also don't want to help out minority clans because they could always become a potential rival in the future. And there's one clan, known as the Isak, which has seen some of the worst violence in the conflict because of their systematic persecution by the government. And so in 1991, this clan declared independence as Somaliland. It acts completely on its own without Somalia's interference. It being relatively poor in natural resources is kind of a blessing in disguise because it prevents warlordism, so Somaliland eventually became peaceful even if it took many years. Peace that Somalia was never able to achieve. And from what I've read, I think there are two main reasons as to why Somalia has had trouble creating peace. First, attempts to create peace have focused too much on a goal that's too hard to achieve, which is a central state. The UN held a conference in Addis Ababa in 1993 to bring peace to Somalia, but they didn't really understand how important the clans were and how Somalia was governed. Like, some clans were overrepresented and others weren't even present. But the conference was focused on creating a central state, so what would be the point of inviting the clans anyway? Well, because Somalis don't really trust the central government since it collapsed in 1991, because it couldn't provide its people with security or services. Instead, elites established order between themselves without the need for a central state, either through agreements or because one clan dominates all of the others. That's also the reason why Al-Shabaab is still around, an Islamic fundamentalist militia which also came to be because of Somalia's lack of provisions. But as long as relative stability between the clans isn't disrupted by Al-Shabaab, the clans don't really have a reason to use up valuable resources to fight Al-Shabaab, so they haven't. And the second reason why it's hard to achieve peace in Somalia is Ethiopia. In the 80s, Ethiopia led movements against Somalia's dictatorship, set up bases in its own territory, and supported them militarily to stop Somalia from supporting rebel groups in Ethiopia and to force border concessions. Ethiopia believed a united Somalia would again strengthen the idea of a greater Somalia, which they think is their main existential threat. And so Ethiopia just kept fanning the flames. But it's not just them. Egypt, Eritrea, Kenya, Sudan, Yemen, and many others have all interfered in the Somali civil war. This conflict is sponsored by literally everyone. Ethiopia also made use of the peace conference in Addis Ababa to encourage rival groups to work together, so that the central Somali state will be more pro-Ethiopian. In 2006 and 2011, they also intervened directly to expel Al-Shabaab. That one's slightly more understandable, but still I think that Ethiopia could have handled the Somali civil war a lot better. But what else could they have done then? Personally, I like Kenya's approach. Kenya's response to all of the chaos on the other side of the border was a lot more calm and diplomatic. Until 2010, it tried to make the different Somali clans reconcile. And they've also addressed internal criminals from Al-Shabaab through its legal system. However, since 2011, they did start intervening militarily due to Al-Shabaab kidnapping tourists and foreign workers on the border, and Kenya needed to keep its international image. However, their response was still pretty calm. They worked together with the AU mission in Somalia, and are only securing the border instead of going all the way to Mogadishu to influence Somali politics like Ethiopia did. Ethiopia, on the other hand, was a lot more forceful with multiple military interventions and internal prosecutions. Their constant interventions meant that Somalia can't get on its feet itself, at least if it had feet. So then why does Ethiopia feel the need to intervene in Somalia over and over again? Well, even with Somalia losing its grip over rebel groups in Ogaden after the war, many conflicts still dragged on there. Like when the Ogaden National Liberation Front, or ONLF, in Ethiopia started denouncing the idea of a greater Somalia, fighting for self-determination instead. When Somalia's dictatorship fell in 1991, so did Ethiopia's, instead being replaced by a federal government known as the EPRDF. It made efforts to encourage Ethiopia's various ethnic groups to participate in the federal system, but reactions to that were mixed. Eventually, armed conflict once again broke out between the ONLF and the EPRDF in Ogaden, which had been renamed to Somali, and since then the conflict has been on and off in Somali. That's pretty bad. You'd think that a federal system like the one Ethiopia adopted would instead decrease tensions, but in this case it looks like it hasn't worked out for the best. It's likely because the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which dominated the EPRDF, made the other ethnic groups feel threatened by not fully implementing their autonomy to try and achieve a balance between unity and ethnic federalism. And of course, that just made each ethnic group resist more. This is a very Ethiopian problem, because Ethiopia is supposed to be exceptional. It wasn't colonized as a result of the Berlin Conference after all, so it's hard for them to let go of unity, lest they'd be painted as another colonizer for letting its federal states secede. So to answer the question I asked when this paragraph began, besides security, Ethiopia's exceptionalism is an important reason for their interference in Somalia. During its nation-building process, Ethiopia became defined by taking over neighboring peoples and not trusting the West after the League of Nations' betrayal of them in the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. It led to Ethiopia being defensive and assertive. Does that excuse Ethiopia's actions in Somalia? No, but it does put it into perspective. One example of the things the EPRDF tried to do in its nation-building process that went against the federal system was known as the Addis Ababa Master Plan of 2014. The plan was to expand the borders of Addis Ababa to integrate some surrounding areas of the federal state of Oromia, which Oromians protested against, sometimes violently. Oromians initially demanded respect for their autonomy, but that quickly turned into demands for regime change. Just like with Anjouan, I don't think Oromians wanted to become independent. They wanted the self-determination they were promised under the federal system. But with the master plan, the EPRDF was trying to have its cake, no ethnic violence, and eat it too. The ability to intervene in the federal states. And that just leads to secession being a preferable alternative. But on a brighter note, Ethiopia has been trying its best to reduce ethnic conflict recently. First of all, when Abiy Ahmed became Ethiopia's president in 2018, the first Oromo chairman of the EPRDF's coalition, he did some political reforms to address ethnic and religious problems. Although, on an unbrighter note, some of those reforms went against the TPLF, like removing Tigrayan government leaders who were accused of corruption and postponing Tigrayan elections in 2020 due to the funny plague. The TPLF organized the elections anyway. The government declared these elections null and void, cut Tigray's budget, and severed communications with Tigray's regional administration, and war soon followed. That's a little heartbreaking. Second of all is their reconciliation with Eritrea, since their relationship had been pretty cold ever since the federation between them collapsed in the 60s. The reason why it took so long for them to start having diplomatic relations again is because Eritrea and the TPLF absolutely hated each other, having a border conflict only 5 years after Eritrea's independence between 1998 and 2000. So now that the TPLF isn't in charge of Ethiopia anymore, Ethiopia and Eritrea restored their diplomatic relations. However, this also had its bad sides. Ethiopia and Eritrea restarting their relations was terrible news for the TPLF, who viewed the reconciliation as an anti-TPLF alliance, which is also partly what fueled the Tigray War in the first place. And despite the war thankfully having ended since then, Eritrea was absent from the peace agreement, even though they were also one of the belligerents, notably being the perpetrators of the Aksum massacre. And that's because Eritrea sucks! The 2008 Global Militarization Index ranked it as the most militarized country in the world. Eritrea doesn't like criticism, it locks up people who disapprove of the president, and it doesn't allow foreign researchers. That's why we use the 2008 index. We can't know how militarized Eritrea is today. Eritrea sucks at nation building. Its proven human rights violations leads to many people leaving and seeking asylum in Ethiopia instead. And most of all, Eritrea loves settling border disputes by force, both with its own army or by supporting armed separatists. In 2008, Eritrean forces started a border skirmish with Djibouti, and repeatedly ignored or denied calls by the UN and Djibouti to withdraw, leading to the UN sanctioning them for that, as well as for their destabilizing role in Somalia, which we talked about earlier. Eritrea also tried to destabilize Ethiopia by boosting the military capacity of the ONLF, and of course it participated in the Tigray War like we saw earlier. So in the end, both of Ethiopia's attempts of getting rid of their ethnic conflicts have had rocky starts. The reconciliation with Eritrea isn't really a good thing, seeing as a country can change its political attitude on a dime because its president is the one who calls all the shots. And given their history of instigating instability in Ethiopia and Somalia, I wouldn't say it's a very trustworthy country. Meanwhile, tensions between Ethiopia and the ONLF have calmed down slightly, but the lack of an actual settlement between them means that conflict is always a possibility, and it keeps undermining Ethiopia's attempts to transform itself socially and politically. These conflicts also never being fought between two consistent parties, but rather a myriad of different governments and militias with their own interests and alliances, means that countries like Eritrea or Somalia can intervene as they please, supporting all kinds of separatist groups. Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea are stuck in a game of what we call doing a little bit of trolling, and they should stop. By the way, believing that Ethiopia's federal borders dictate the home of certain ethnic groups is wrong, because there will always be ethnic minorities in these areas, and Ethiopia doesn't have the institutions to protect them against violence. They also can be represented by legislative or executive organs. Wow, surely there's no way that can lead to conflict. Cuff. So as I said in the intro, the Afrobarometer has measured that Africans generally have a high amount of tolerance for foreigners living near them. But do they? Yes, the answer is obviously yes, they do tolerate them. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some hiccups along the way to that tolerance. Let's talk a little bit about migration. Before decolonization, elites in Ghana and Ivory Coast often sent their children abroad for their education, since education wasn't always of the best quality at home. After the countries became independent, many of those who left wanted to return to their home country to introduce what they've learned overseas and take a leadership role in the new country, replacing the foreign officials who had been working for the former colonies. One Ivorian who Amasari interviewed explained that people returned because of a nationalistic attitude. Nationalism worked a little differently in Africa in comparison to how European nationalism worked. While in Europe it often led to wars, the Balkan ones are a prime example of that, there haven't been too many wars between two independent countries in Africa. Instead, nationalism was more internal and got used a lot for nation building. But that kind of nationalism didn't stick around. Nowadays, Ghanaians and Ivorians who live abroad believe that their country can develop without them. And if they do come back, then it's either because they feel like they can contribute and get recognized for their hard work more in Ghana or Ivory Coast, or because Europeans were being racist. And another side effect of that nationalism disappearing is that a new kind of nationalism came in its place in Ghana, Ivory Coast, and even other countries like Nigeria. In 1969, Ghana passed the Aliens Compliance Order, deporting African and non-African immigrants from the country, a lot of which were Nigerians. Nigeria, as another example, deported 1 million Ghanaians in 1983. Well, that's awkward. So nationalism in Africa sometime after decolonization became more so focused on getting foreigners out instead of getting the colonial powers out. And that sparked some debates within these countries, like who here is actually a citizen, who shouldn't be a citizen, who can run for office, who can even vote. Well, Ivory Coast thought it had answers to those questions. It was a very economically successful country until they got struck by a bunch of crises in the 80s. But migrant farmers, many from Burkina Faso, who had settled in the country during the boom, were doing relatively well compared to Ivorian farmers, and so were used as a scapegoat. In 1998, Ivory Coast passed a code saying that only people who were Ivorian are allowed to buy land, classifying those foreigners as not Ivorian. There was also a law stating that you could only run for office if both of your parents were born in Ivory Coast, which was probably directly targeted at Ouattara, a very popular enemy politician among immigrants. This resulted in a coup, a conflict, and a ceasefire in 2003. Throughout all of those years, people had begun to consider Ivorians who lived in the north, who were mostly Muslims, to also be strangers to the country. This came to a head in the 2011 elections when Ouattara won, but actually, those results weren't real because suddenly 4 northern regions weren't allowed to vote anymore, leading to 10% of the votes evaporating into thin air and Ouattara losing. Bro, did you even try to make this look democratic? So yeah, you know what comes next. Violence. In the end, Ouattara became the president with some international support, but the damage had already been done. Many people in the western regions, for example, fled into Liberia. However, Liberia also wasn't in the best shape at the time, leaving them unprepared for the wave of immigrants. This is because Liberia had experienced 2 civil wars between 1989 and 2003, and 85% of Liberians were killed, displaced, or fled the country. Liberia faced the same kind of nationalism that Ivory Coast or Ghana or Nigeria faced. The Mandinka people, for example, were often denied from owning land or local political authority. But, surprisingly, the people who experienced more violence than others during the Liberian civil wars were actually more altruistic towards Ivorians who were fleeing due to the Ivorian crisis. They allowed more refugees to stay with them, often refugees who appeared to be in more distress than others, and they were less biased towards the ethnic group the refugee was a part of. That's awesome, but why is that the case? Well, there's probably a lot of reasons. It's not like we can just pin it down to one thing, but a major one is probably the Liberian refugee camps. So since 85% of Liberians were killed, displaced, or fled, you can imagine that refugee camps hosted Liberians of many different ethnicities, including those who were, on paper, against each other in the war. But thankfully, camps provide an opportunity for these people to have genuine, non-violent interactions with each other, and those interactions create more trust, empathy, and forgiveness. And they can extend that gratitude towards the refugees from Ivory Coast, because they understand what it feels like to be in their situation. Africa is still on a rocky road of trying to include immigrants, but things are progressing, and I feel pretty hopeful. So I hope that after all of that, I've made a reasonable case as to why ethnic differences don't automatically lead to conflict, but instead that there are underlying problems in a country's administration which were often caused deliberately by colonial powers, which makes ethnicity more of a rallying cry in those conflicts. This is why the borders I drew don't really matter, as long as the government can provide all of the necessary services. But if you disagree, then make sure to leave a comment. Though I'd also like to quickly go over some other conflicts to make my point a bit more clear. First, the Western Togoland secessionist movement in Ghana, which I think is a party patronage issue like Kenya's, especially since food insecurity in Ghana is likely caused by that patronage. There's also Zimbabwe, where the southern Ndabula are labeled as foreigners compared to the majority Shona, which I believe is similar to what happened in Ivory Coast. Namibia refuses to negotiate with its Lozi population, which has made their secessionist movement a lot more violent compared to Zambia's Lozi movement, since they negotiate with each other. Senegal didn't give the southern Casamance region civil service jobs or boarding schools, which made them want to secede, although Senegal has been trying to make things up. Unfortunately, the situation is kinda out of their control because of the Gambia's and Guinea-Bissau's intervention, like a smaller scale Ethiopia and Somalia. And finally, Angola's Cabinda exclave is geographically separated from the rest of the country, and Angola likes to put Cabinda's various factions up against each other, like a divide and rule strategy. Being exclave naturally also made it harder for them to get access to services. But do keep in mind that every country I've mentioned so far isn't representative for all of Africa. Each African country has developed differently, and should be discussed in their own context instead of in an overview of a couple like what I've done. But I hope that the examples I gave give you an idea as to some of the causes of ethnic conflicts, and that also goes for any country I'll mention going forward. In any case, services are what I think these conflicts usually boil down to, especially education, as you can see by the Casamance example. But education as a service in Africa unfortunately has a little bit of a grim side. Even if the state is able to provide its citizens with schools and good teachers, we still have to ask a very important question. Are the students even able to understand what the teacher is saying at school? In other words, do they speak the same language? In 2016, UNICEF released a report where they reviewed language policy and education quality in 21 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa. It found that, quote, using the mother tongue in the classroom enhances classroom participation, decreases attrition, and increases the likelihood of family and community engagement in the child's learning, unquote. And using the mother tongue to instruct students also, quote, enhances the child's cognitive learning processes, and that learner-centered learning has to be carried out in the language the child speaks in order to be effective, unquote. So it sure would be unfortunate if African education systems use a language that isn't the mother tongue of most students, right? Right? English is the most common language spoken in classrooms in almost all of the countries that were studied, and is an official language in primary schools in 2/3 of those countries. Well then. So a lot of language policies in these 21 countries do dictate that local languages should be used in lower levels of education, and there certainly has been progress in that regard. Like in 2020, when Madagascar developed a plan to help students learn both French and Malagasy by using them both at the same time just for different subjects, and South Africa has made learning some African languages compulsory at its universities. But most African countries don't often apply their own local language policies in favor of international languages. Using mother tongues in Lesotho is enforced by law, but it doesn't specify which languages those mother tongues are, so they're often not spoken in primary school. The Seychelles made Seychellois Creole an official language right after independence, and its policy of teaching it, as well as English and French, have increased the amount of graduations and the literacy rate. But the archipelago doesn't have a university to support Creole, so students travel abroad to French-speaking and English-speaking universities instead. Angola standardized the spelling of 6 African languages in its territory, and those languages appear on TV and on the radio. But language policy in Angola often isn't discussed, and educators, linguists, and teachers are never part of those discussions, so African languages still have a low status. Families in Mozambique feel pressure to teach their children Portuguese, instead of any Bantu language due to the former's economic and political status. German speakers in Namibia are losing influence to English, but since German speakers are often wealthier than native language speakers, they can't afford to keep the language alive in the education system, which African languages can't do. Children in Nigeria often have to drop out of school, making it so that they don't know any language well enough to express themselves, which is called semi-lingualism. White Kenyans only speak Kiswahili in informal situations, which consciously or not keeps English alive as the dominant formal language. Shikomori is spoken by nearly all Comorians, but the education system only used French and Arabic. Native Congolese languages struggle to obtain prestige due to a high illiteracy rate and code mixing with other languages, which messes up sentence structures. Mauritius still has a hierarchy between its languages, split up between colonial languages, Asian languages, and native languages, which it kept from its colonial days. Zambia has certain education programs in agriculture and health which are taught in local languages, but it has no policy-making body, so none of it is legally binding. Zimbabwe recognized 16 different languages as official in 2013, but it's difficult to teach them because they lack stuff like textbooks. And in general, it's hard to implement the UN Sustainable Development Goals in Africa due to trouble with communicating them to Africans, again because of the language gap. All of these countries have tried their best to get native languages into the education system, but the pull of international languages is just way too strong. So what makes them so attractive in the first place? Well, first of all, coloniality has a lot to do with it, which refers to the ongoing effect of colonization in power structures, knowledge, and what have you. Using English in the African education system is an obvious example of that. Second is because the native language's terminology or grammar might not be developed enough in order to be taught, like that example in the DRC I just discussed. But most of all, they just pay the bills. Globalization has increased the prestige of languages like English and French, making them very desirable to learn to be in a better economic and social position. The use of local languages in education would block Southern and Eastern African countries who want their citizens to be a part of a global community. So while policies exist to support local languages, these countries want to sidestep them. Why do you think I'm speaking English to you right now? But even if using English or other international languages has its advantages due to globalization, it still prevents students who don't know any of those languages from learning or getting high enough grades. But there are also advantages to English being such a prominent language in Southern and Eastern Africa. South Africa, for example, is one of the most linguistically diverse countries in the world, so English is a useful lingua franca between them, helping minority language groups reach success. So yeah, both international languages and native languages have clear economic and social advantages. So then, why do we even have to choose? Why not teach both? Why not use the native language in primary school to learn the international language, and then use the international language alongside the native one once the students have a high enough level of proficiency in it? Well, there are indeed countries who have realized that this is a possibility. Let's take a look. Tanzania is one of the most politically stable countries in Africa, having had no civil wars, no coup d'etat, or violent national elections, and notably it's been able to develop a Tanzanian national identity. Not many African countries have had success in developing their own. Tanzania was also able to intentionally keep down the influence of English and instead use Kiswahili to achieve unity and progress. Unlike a lot of those other countries we discussed earlier, Kiswahili is still the language spoken in primary school. Kiswahili is also the language spoken in the parliament and used by most media. So how has Tanzania been able to stay so stable while also being able to use its own native language? Green argues that the basis of Tanzania's stability came from its dispersed population. Being so dispersed meant that there were less opportunities for inequalities to develop between them. At the same time, Tanzania has never been rich in terms of workers or capital, so there was never a need to fight over that sort of stuff. The reason why its population is so evenly dispersed across Tanzania in the first place was because arable land was also evenly spread out, and because many people fled major settlements due to slave traders and German tax collectors. After World War I, colonial Tanganyika lost more than a third of its population due to Rwanda and Burundi going to Belgium, which made labor even scarcer. As the League of Nations mandate, Tanzania didn't get as much investment from Britain, but it also made it so that Britain wasn't able to mess too much with its politics like they could in Kenya, for example. The result was that there were no areas in Tanzania where either capital or labor were more prevalent than in the rest of the country. Although there is one exception. Zanzibar was its own sovereign state before uniting with Tanganyika to create Tanzania in 1964, but many Zanzibaris still claim sovereignty. Zanzibar was more so than Tanganyika built on racial and class divides, which would never really subside after becoming a part of Tanzania. So Tanzania benefited from its population dispersion to become politically stable, but then how did that make Kiswahili the dominant language? Well, in the 60s and 80s, Tanzania was under the Ujamaa regime, a kind of Tanzanian socialism. It made some institutions to protect equality, and so it's partly responsible for making ethnicity not as important in Tanzanian politics, and you can still see that today. Tanzanian citizens around the Kenyan border, for example, don't punish people of other ethnic groups any more than they punish people of their own ethnic group, whereas in Kenya they do. Although Kenya's statistics have a low confidence level, so take that as you will. Tanzanians are generally more sympathetic towards other ethnic groups, as they're less willing to pay taxes if other ethnic groups are being treated worse by the government. Tanzanian museums also promote the concept of being a Tanzanian, in comparison to Kenya, which celebrates ethnic differences more. In the end, I think both are acceptable. But most importantly for this segment, the Ujamaa regime saw Kiswahili as a language that could help with the nation building of Tanzania. And so it was standardized and spread, becoming the language used in primary schools in an attempt to get rid of English in education. So yeah, good for you, Tanzania. Learning both Kiswahili and English is bound to improve your students' education while still making you an international player. Wouldn't it be great if that was the end of the story? So far, we've been assuming that Kiswahili is the only native language in Tanzania, but what about all of those other languages? It's not like we can expect those people to immediately understand either Kiswahili or English. So that's why Tanzanian parents want their children to learn multiple languages, Kiswahili, English, and their native one. But that native language isn't used in the education system, so parents instead see themselves as a teacher of that language. For example, Maasai parents want their children to know how to speak Ma as well. But it's only seen as a cultural language, while Kiswahili needs to be learned for its utility and English needs to be learned for its economic benefits. They don't actually want their children to learn Ma at school. Okay, so we're literally just back at square one then. We've already established that schools which don't teach in the language that the students know leads to the students performing worse. So then, despite Kiswahili supposedly preventing that issue, it won't actually prevent anything because people like the Ma can't automatically speak Kiswahili without education. Many teachers even think that the Ma language is a barrier to educational success and won't bother using it at all, even when pupils speak to each other in Ma, and it could help clarify difficult vocabulary. But even when leaving aside minority native languages, even if a student's mother tongue is Kiswahili, then they still face some issues in the education system. Because despite Swahili legally being allowed to be a language of instruction, English still dominates, even in primary schools. So why is that the case? Well, first of all, because the UK and the US said so and they have all the money. Second of all, because Tanzanian elites can unfairly raise the performance of their children because they have better access to teaching material. And third of all, because parents think English is necessary for economic success. It's an intentional language gap between elites and the rest of the population made by elites. But this is the exact same problem that Ethiopia faces in its language and education policy. Since Amharic is such a well-known language in Ethiopia, it arguably has the exact same advantages as Tanzania does with Kiswahili. But the elite would rather send their children to English or French-speaking schools, while minority groups send theirs to Amharic ones instead of ones that speak their own language. You're so close to actually being bilingual, but the pull of international languages is ever present. Yes, Tanzania's language and education policy is better than most other sub-Saharan African countries, but some of its quirks need to be worked on a little. In the end though, it could be worse. Like, imagine if the international languages were also in conflict, for example. That'd be unfortunate. Well, we don't have to imagine because Cameroon exists. Since the government violently repressed peaceful protests in 2016, the English-speaking part of Cameroon has led an armed separatist movement which wants to become independent under the name Ambazonia. The protests were about a large amount of French-speaking teachers and judges from the rest of Cameroon coming to work in the English-speaking areas, undermining the legal system and education system there. Alright, you know the drill by now. Let's look into Cameroon's history to find out why this conflict exists. German Cameroon was split up between France and Britain after World War I. However, the British territories were a lot smaller than the French ones, and so they were integrated into Nigeria's colonial administration. The southern Cameroons wanted independence during decolonization, but Britain and the UN refused, instead leaving it up to a vote of either joining Nigeria or Cameroon. Unfortunate for them, but they hated Nigeria, so at least the choice was easy. The 1961 Constitution of Cameroon made it into a federal state comprised of the Francophones and Anglophones, but letting things stay that way was never the plan. In 1972, Cameroon became a unitary state instead, and the Anglophone territories became just two of many regions in Cameroon. Western Cameroon was simply too profitable to keep them as a federal state. It contained a lot of natural resources, plantations, and oil refineries, and so Cameroon is dead set on solving the issue militarily. It made it so that federation wasn't on the table anymore, which radicalized Anglophone Cameroons, and so they wanted secession instead. You'd think that this would be a very awkward situation for France and Britain, but surprisingly, the international community doesn't really seem to care. Western powers want to protect their economic and political interests in the Gulf of Guinea, so having good relations with Cameroon is more profitable. France especially doesn't want to interfere in order to protect the Francophonie. The African Union meekly supports Cameroon, and the UN can't do anything, because every time the topic is brought to the Security Council, France, China or Russia vetoes away the topic. Ambazonia's own parties also can't seem to work together, just like how Cabinda's groups are also fragmented, for example. This lack of international pressure means that Cameroon can simply keep centralizing, keep militarily repressing the region, and then face the international community to deny that the Anglophone problem is even a thing. Ambazonia also tends to dig its own grave due to blaming all Francophones. A lot of Francophones have been sympathetic to the Anglophones, seeing the government's violent policy, but regular citizens being given the blame alienates them. And because of that, the Francophone reaction to the problem is mixed. And even then, the majority of Francophones don't know any better, because either they think that ethnic connections transcend the language issue, or they don't even know that the problem exists because the government says that it doesn't. So Francophones aren't inherently against Anglophones in Cameroon. In fact, just like in a lot of countries we discussed in the previous chapter, Cameroonians see a lot of benefits in learning both languages. When the country became independent, learning English was compulsory for Francophones, and learning French was compulsory for Anglophones, and pidgin languages between the two also came to be. Teachers developed their own education program in the 90s to promote bilingualism, because job recruiters wanted people to be bilingual. But the reason why this never worked out is because the government never made a body to oversee bilingual education, meaning that teachers weren't punished for straying away from bilingualism. Anglophones and Francophones want to learn each other's languages, but the government doesn't want to put in the work. Because of the lack of international recognition of the Anglophone problem, Cameroonians have simply had to resist from the ground up. The Bilingual Education Initiative is just one example. Another is the use of native languages with language mixing to create new languages like Franglais, and use them online to show off a national identity. And importantly, there are movements to stop the violence in general, especially from women of every single region who advocate against gender-based violence in the war. Unfortunately, however, this is one conflict that is very unlikely to be resolved soon. The lack of international action means that the Cameroonian government can continue pretending like the problem isn't real, and the status quo isn't an acceptable outcome anymore. That's why the international community needs to step in and force all sides to negotiate, especially with federalism as an option. But thankfully, it's good to know that Cameroonians themselves don't mind the linguistic difference and prefer peace instead. So now that we've seen a country that officially speaks multiple international languages, let's look at a country that officially speaks multiple African languages, the melting pot. South Africa approaches nation building in a way that I think we haven't really seen before in this video. You could call it a pluralist country, because its various ethnic groups are acknowledged to exist, and positive relations between them are encouraged. This is reflected in South Africa having 12 official languages, including South African Sign Language alongside a swath of African languages, so English is the only official international language. But this wasn't always the case. In 1951, South Africa's apartheid regime created 8, later 10 self-governing areas, excluding those in Namibia, which were drawn based on ethnic groups and were supposedly created to prepare them for independence. These were called Bantustans or homelands. And I think you already know what happens when you pretend that an ethnic group has a certain homeland. In these homelands, citizens had no more South African citizenship, and Africans were forcefully deported over there if they were part of a specific ethnic group that had a homeland. As a result, the people in the Bantustans were overcrowded, and many of them lacked employment or food, and they were still economically dependent on South Africa. So when apartheid ended in 1993, Bantustans disappeared, and South Africa wrote a new constitution, forcing itself to protect the equal rights of every official language. Promising to do so is obviously a great step forward, but as you can imagine, if it's already difficult for most African countries to elevate just one African language to be on the same status as an international language, having to do so for all of South Africa's official languages is a doozy. The only African language that saw some development during apartheid was Afrikaans, and all of the other African languages weren't developed because they were never intended to be used in higher education. So when universities tried to teach students in their mother tongues in order to attract more students from 2000 onwards, it completely backfired, because those languages weren't up to snuff with their vocabulary. So as usual, African languages are taught in primary schools, but are rarely spoken in secondary schools or universities. Of course, that doesn't mean that English doesn't have its advantages. Like I said in 2.1, it's a neutral language that can mitigate conflict and help bolster South Africa's identity. But like I said before with Tanzania, it would be best if English wasn't the only language used to teach. Zulu-speaking students, for example, would like to use their native language to understand things taught to them in English a little better. isiXhosa-speaking students process the subject matter better if they have access to material in both English and their native language. So while English is still the preferred language in higher education, native languages can assist them in learning the subject matter. Integrating both English and an African language in a textbook helps, for example. And in some ways, this evolution of African languages and English assisting each other is already taking place in South Africa. Some Afrikaans institutions allow students to choose which language they want to use to do a test, English or Afrikaans. It'd be great if that was implemented for other African languages too. Peers communicating with each other also like to use their own language and English interchangeably, which is called code switching. Professors or other professionals would also benefit from bilingualism, since they often have to work in multilingual communities anyway, and they can add scientific terms to African languages by copying them from English and maybe changing them a little. So English can definitely help African languages become more professional, but the same can be done with the help of other African languages. So students who speak an African language might want to learn another African language, but unfortunately for them, that idea isn't explored much, besides in the University of South Africa. So if it's not taught to them, then students are just gonna have to help themselves. And that's where translanguaging comes in. Translanguaging was first studied in Wales, where students listen to a lesson in one language and then process it in another language. It helps students understand the subject matter better and makes them more knowledgeable of their weaker language. So using this concept between African languages, you could show off similarities between the Sotho and Nguni or Sepedi languages, to explain to the students that the boundaries between these languages are actually pretty fluid, as well as help them access scientific terms in another language that aren't present in their own one. Through translanguaging, students get a larger pool of vocabulary at their disposal, and it helps students get rid of stereotypes of certain languages in their heads. And that's why the homelands were also detrimental for language. Separating different ethnic groups into their own homelands prevents interaction between different languages, and as a result, prevents the languages from evolving to become a better one through sharing scientific terminology or articulating certain feelings better with words from both languages. Translanguaging exposes that languages don't need to have clear boundaries. Then, neither does my map need to be based on clear language boundaries. The main African languages these countries would speak wouldn't develop much anyway due to the policy of using international languages in education. Just like with borders based on ethnicity actually requiring good governance to mean anything, borders based on language require good language and education policies to mean anything too. Otherwise, these borders wouldn't fix anything at all. So why am I still talking about languages if the answer to resolve linguistic conflicts in education is to just talk? You know what? True. I'm gonna stop talking about languages now. Whee! "85 to 90% of Africans identify as Christian or Muslim, and they're some of the most devout in the world. Religion is central in many of their social and political lives, so African religious leaders can shape social and political behavior. And this gives me a good opportunity to talk about Northern Africa, a region I've been ignoring so far because it's pretty stable in terms of ethnicity and language. It even has its own barometer together with the Middle East, separate from the Afrobarometer, called the Arab Barometer, although they're not mutually exclusive or anything. Countries like Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco have Sunni Muslims comprising more than 98% of the population, and Islam being the religion of their states is enshrined in their constitutions. Those constitutions were made pretty recently though, written as a result of the early 2010s Arab Spring, in which people protested against corruption, poverty, and inequality in the Arab world. Tunisia and Egypt transitioned to democracy, though it didn't last in Egypt. Morocco's king had to transfer some powers to elected politicians. Algeria had protests, but they didn't last too long. And Libya is a whole can of worms that will remain closed for the time being. The reason why the protests in Algeria didn't last so long was because there were already protests before the 2010s, which didn't work out so well. Algerians rose up against the one-party state in 1988, and even though this led to the signing of a new constitution in 1989, Algeria's army intervened in 1992 to stop the legislative elections. What followed was a civil war, resulting in a deep distrust between nationalists, secularists, liberals, and fundamentalists, who all disliked each other as much as they disliked the regime. The country has had a dominant political class since its independence in 1962, and could portray the Arab Spring as a threat to Algeria's national unity. So when it rolled around, groups opposing the regime both didn't trust each other and didn't form coalitions across classes or ideologies. So democratic reform was limited in Algeria, unfortunately. But surely there are examples of the opposite. Well, since 2011, Egypt's political factions have consistently tried to exclude their opponents from power, which turned out so poorly for them that since 2018, with the regime of al-Sisi, free and fair elections and human rights have been reversed in Egypt. Okay, bad example. Let's hear something actually good. In general, the Arab Spring led to a decline in ethno-religious trust and tolerance across North Africa and the Middle East. Oh wait, this is a pattern, isn't it? So yeah, the Arab Spring was definitely a step in the right direction to democratize North African countries, but it's just that, a step. While they couldn't avoid modernity entirely, these states having made religious practices central to their identities makes reforms face resistance from tradition, and makes the state more resistant to criticism. It's difficult to reinterpret that religion, because it makes fundamentalists more defensive and liberals more pushy, making it way too hard to reach a compromise, even in a now generally democratic country like Tunisia. It's part of the reason why the Arab Spring failed in Egypt. Both fundamentalists and liberals made demands that didn't allow for compromise. And in the countries where compromises were made, having to appease both groups has resulted in their constitutions being incredibly vague. Tunisia's constitution protects the sacred, which should imply all religions, but it also wants people to still be committed to only Islam. Algeria's constitution protects free choice, but affirms that Algeria is a land of Islam. Morocco's constitution protects the rights of man and international humanitarian law, but insists that its national identity is made by Islam. All three of their constitutions guarantee freedom of worship, but what kind of worship? Are those freedoms also being extended towards Shia Muslims and Christians? Are these freedoms in the room with us right now? This vagueness has left people in power to just interpret the laws however they want to. Like, putting this stuff in their constitutions means that these countries are clearly willing to make a compromise between fundamentalists and liberals, and yet the laws seem so indecisive. This really sucks because Islam doesn't have to be an obstacle for North Africa's modernization. It's not like being more religious equals less progress in modernization. A lot of the time, it's the opposite. People who read the Quran in Tunisia and Egypt, for example, very religious people, were more likely to protest during the Arab Spring to modernize. Religiosity also helps with building trust, as very religious Muslims trust others more if they are also religious. Religious gatherings allow people to bond with others in their religious group, which could then also be used to bridge the gaps with other religious groups. And religion doesn't always suppress opportunities in North Africa, as success in business is caused more often by social capital and connections. So I personally don't think that religiosity automatically leads to less democracy or less tolerance. A lot of the time, religiosity can lead to wanting democratic reforms and being more accepting of others. Countries can also use religion to improve their relations with other countries. Morocco, for example, has a lot of influence over West Africa in terms of religion, because they invest in those countries and are perceived as having historical legitimacy. That's also why they can easily claim Western Sahara to be a part of them, which doesn't have the resources to get much religious clout. It's hard to have an informed opinion on the status of Western Sahara. Morocco denies entry to scholars who want to do research in Moroccan-controlled Western Sahara, and Western Sahara's Polisario government also isn't transparent about its population figures, especially those of its refugee camps in Algeria. Research is likely to be skewed anyway, because Morocco has populated the territory with settlers who are meant to vote in favor of Western Sahara's integration into Morocco if an independence referendum were to ever happen. Moroccan-controlled Western Sahara isn't even governed by international law, because international law doesn't recognize the occupation, so we don't even have stuff like reports on human rights or non-governmental organizations on the ground. It also allows Morocco to restrict freedom of expression in the region, and violence is used to ensure that those restrictions become normalized, even against children. That's why I don't want to keep talking about this topic, but the Moroccan government's decisions in Moroccan-controlled Western Sahara are questionable to say the least. But anyways, back on track. If I'm saying that religiosity doesn't lead to intolerance or autocracy, then why are there still tensions between or inside certain religious groups? Well, as for the between part, I think it has more so to do with the status of a religion as a minority or a majority. Let's go back to Morocco for this. In 2016, many Muslim leaders signed the Marrakesh Declaration, in which they pledged to protect the rights of all religious groups in their own countries. Even before that point, Morocco has expanded women's rights in 2004 and trained imams to promote tolerance in 2003. And that's really great. That's some serious progress right there. But do keep in mind that these reforms were made with Islam in mind. Morocco doesn't actually give its citizens a lot of room for religious freedom. Those reforms were more so meant for social cohesion and to prevent extremism. Freedom of religion is technically legal in the constitution, but as we've discussed, the constitution is incredibly vague. And so in reality, it's very complicated to not be a Sunni Muslim, or more specifically Maliki in Morocco. Non-Maliki Muslims aren't registered as official religious organizations. They can't gather for religious ceremonies and can't have their own political parties. So you are allowed to convert from Islam, But if you try to take space in society as a non-Maliki Muslim, that's where Morocco starts to get involved, because you are technically a threat to its national unity. But it's not like this is limited to Morocco or anything. For Christians specifically, the Open Doors watch list has Algeria and Libya doing even more poorly in this regard, and also deserves scrutiny. Stuff like this alienates people who fall outside the state's religion, and that might be why non-Muslim minorities in the Middle East and North Africa are less tolerant of others, because they feel threatened by others. It's not the contents of any religion that makes people intolerant of other religions, rather their status as a majority or minority in a specific location. I mean, why else do you think Europeans are Islamophobic? So that's the between part of the religious tolerance question answered, but what about the inside part? Well, I ignored Libya earlier, but now is where it becomes relevant. It was very difficult for the Arab Spring to result in a constitution in Libya. Since 1977, Libya was instead ruled by the Green Book, which gave all power to the ruler instead of political parties or institutions. So when democratic elections came to Libya in 2012, the lack of institutions, destroyed by both the prior regime and the revolution, meant that becoming democratic was not in the cards for Libya. A civil war began in 2014, not between just two parties, but with multiple different parties plus international interference. The state lost its monopoly on violence, and so various armed groups filled the security vacuum in their own regions. These groups are against rebuilding the army or the state, because they want to substitute it themselves, but are as a result a threat to security, mostly just killing members of the previous regime as revenge. And the civil war turned into a proxy war which just prolonged it. But before that, something that the Libyan army did in 2011 to prevent the fall of the regime was to recruit forces from other countries, notably Mali, Niger, and Chad. Many of them were Tuareg groups who lived in northern Mali, and when the regime fell, they returned back home. And while most of them were reintegrated into Mali's armed forces, some were more inspired by Libya, and it began a new Tuareg nationalist movement. In 2012, the north of Mali declared independence as Azawad, and Mali got couped as a result. And while the rebellion was put down in 2013, albeit with major French help, it's important to bring up because it flared up again recently in 2023 due to the Malian junta not implementing the peace deal signed in 2015. And yes, I said junta because Mali got couped again after 2012. Twice. Okay, so surely this war didn't just happen because of the Libyan revolution, right? Well yeah, of course, there are other reasons. First of all, France used a divide and conquer strategy in the Sahel. Who could have guessed? The Tuaregs were given certain privileges like not being subjected to forced labor or conscription, but the downsides were that they also weren't given any help in education, that their neighbors didn't like them because of their privileges, and that they were split up between 5 different states after decolonization. But another reason for the war is similar to the Libyan revolution, in that the region was lacking institutions. Mali's 1992 constitution established a multi-party democracy, but it couldn't be implemented in the north due to the lack of institutions weakening the political elite there, and so Mali couldn't uphold security in the Tuareg areas. In the end, the lack of authority from elites or resources in the north meant that there could be no elections or even a functioning economy, problems that Mali just ignored. And that's why fighting took place throughout the 90s and 2000s, not even specifically because of Tuareg nationalism, because that only became more relevant after the Libyan revolution, rather because of internal politics and economic issues. So now you may be asking, well, if this is about Tuareg nationalism, then what's this doing in the religion section and not the ethnic section? Well, the MNLA, the Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, wasn't the only group fighting for independence. There were also fundamentalists who mixed Tuareg nationalism and Muslim rule. When those fundamentalists were defeated, many of them joined the MNLA, turning the crisis into a religious conflict. But even though it's a religious conflict, there wasn't really much religious discrimination in Mali beforehand. So why did a conflict of this nature break out? It's because of already existing tensions between northern and southern Mali that weren't based on religion, which we've discussed, which were only intensified due to people being mobilized along religious lines, with radical ideas coming from outside, like from Mauritania's 2010 religious conflict, or again the Libyan revolution's Tuareg mercenaries. So just like how I don't think religiosity necessarily leads to intolerance or autocracy, I don't think it makes countries more prone to religious conflicts either. Instead, radicalization of religion creates religious conflicts. And when you combine radicalization with already existing ethnic and linguistic conflicts, then let's just say you've got a serious problem on your hands. So far, I've only been looking at countries that are almost 100% Muslim in an attempt to prove why religiosity doesn't lead to violence, but not looking at countries that don't have a majority religion would be a big mistake. Eswatini, for example, guarantees religious freedom, but its police monitors mosques and Christian education is compulsory. So what about conflicts between religions? Well, let's look at Nigeria, a country that's almost completely split down the middle between Christians in the south and Muslims in the north. And indeed, the two sides have been in violent competition with each other for influence all throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s. You get the drill by now. I'm too stubborn to take this at face value. So let's look at Nigeria's history and figure out why this is the case. Oh my god, wow, it's divide and conquer again. That's crazy! So the British wanted to prevent Muslims from interacting with Christians or Western immigrants because they feared it would mess up the colonial administration in the north. So they introduced the Sabongari system. There are towns in northern Nigeria where only Christians are supposed to live in order to segregate them from the native Muslim population, making it difficult for the people who live there to become a part of their local communities, and violence frequently occurred. The British also gave the North a high degree of autonomy because of the threat of their secession. So when Nigeria became independent in 1960, the Northern Hausa and Fulani groups came to dominate the country's politics. In 1966, there was a coup and a counter-coup. Igbo, who lived in the north, aka the Sabongari, were killed in the process and fled back to the south where their ethnic group is mostly settled. And bada bing bada boom, the Igbo declared independence as Biafra in 1967 and they were defeated in 1970. Since then, Nigeria's democracy has had a rough time. In the 2007 elections, a Muslim came to power with extreme vote rigging, and so there were protests in the south. In the 2011 elections, a Christian came to power, and so there were protests in the north, because the position was supposed to rotate between Muslims and Christians every 2 terms instead of 1 like what happened here. Disagreements between the Igbo and Hausa Fulani never really seemed to go away. But that doesn't mean that they can't go away. Look at the Yoruba, for example. Whereas the Igbo and Hausa Fulani see their struggle as equally an ethnic and religious one, the Yoruba are more divided when it comes to religion. So if a Yoruba wants to support its group, then they'll have to put their ethnic group above their religion. There's less violence when religions don't overlap with ethnicity, like in Yoruba land, where tolerance of other religions is more common. So while both religions want to gain influence in multi-religious areas, they have to do it in such a way that they don't step on the toes of the other. Christian leaders in religiously evenly split locations don't want to spread Christianity aggressively, because then they won't get the support of half of the citizens in their area. So instead they just advocate for freedom of worship. However, in areas that have a small majority of Christians, religious leaders actually do take more aggressive stances, because they feel as if Muslims are going to take over. That's what we've already seen with the minority-majority thing. At least those religious leaders who marginalize other religious communities aren't supported much by people who have had positive interactions with people of other religions. But keep in mind that all of the research data that Dowd presented was collected in 2006. That's a long time ago now, and something very important happened in between then and now, which might have an effect on the religious tolerance we've been looking at so far. So, in the northeast of Nigeria, there is a fundamentalist group whose name I also do not want to say out loud on YouTube, so I'm just gonna call them BH. They already existed before 2006, but it's only in 2009 that they were given international attention due to an escalation of violence. So now you've got an extremist group on top of already existing tensions between your ethnic and religious groups. I wonder how this will turn out. So in Mali's case, the cause of the rise of a radical group was a lack of institutions creating a lack of security. Does the same apply to Nigeria? Well, maybe. I can't tell you for certain because Nigerians have mixed opinions about why BH exists. Looking at university students, the majority of Southerners, Igbo and Christians, blame the uprising on religion. Meanwhile, Northerners, Hausa Fulani and Muslims are more indecisive, but tend to favor unemployment as the cause, and they also blamed other injustices a lot more than the South. The Yoruba and Central Nigerians are pretty split up regarding this matter. Christians also believe that the conflict could dissolve Nigeria, while Muslims are more optimistic and think that things could improve. Muslims are also more confident that a military solution could solve the issue, while Christians don't have confidence in such a solution. So who's right? Well, there's never really a good answer to that question, is there? And frankly, I don't think I'm interested in answering it. Like, I'm sure that there are certain people in BH who are there because they want to implement Sharia law, and that there are certain others who want to be employed. I don't think we have to choose one side of the coin here. Whatever the case, it's clear that BH took the ethno-religious cleavages that existed in Nigeria and ripped them open for the world to see, making the divide between the North and South even stronger. And that's why I don't need to find out why the conflict exists, but instead why the conflict persists. Cause if we know that, we could still stop it. Let's look at how other countries have handled similar conflicts, to see if we can find inspiration there. Regarding BH, every country around Lake Chad takes a hardline approach against them. They don't consider de-radicalizing captured soldiers of BH by providing demobilization programs, instead they repress them. Nigeria itself has committed extrajudicial killings and allowed people to die in its prisons from illnesses. This unfortunately only gives BH more of a reason to resist, even legitimizing their cause in the eyes of people who have been wronged by Nigeria's, Chad's, Cameroon's or Niger's governments. This expansion has even victimized Muslims outside of BH's sphere of influence, like in Togo for example, which uses the fear accumulated by BH's expansion to mobilize their citizens against Muslim political rivals. It's based on another divide and rule strategy used by the British, French and Germans in Togo to portray certain Muslims as good, those who wouldn't threaten the colonial order, and other Muslims as bad, those who were seen as threatening them. It's a policy that Togo inherited from them. That's how they were able to portray their main rival party as bad Muslims when the citizens protested in favor of that party in 2017 and 2018, portraying their leader as an Islamic fundamentalist threat. So it looks like Nigeria isn't the only one handling the conflict poorly. If those actions only make BH more legitimate in people's eyes, then that only makes them stronger. People don't trust the legal system to give them amnesty, so prisoners who are able to escape because BH attacked their prisons, for example, often just join them outright. People who want to avoid being arrested, tortured, or killed in prison join BH to prevent that from happening, and the threat of being killed in prison radicalizes BH even more. So it seems pretty obvious that continuing to use military or judicial force is a strategy that's bound to backfire. Instead, wouldn't it be better to rehabilitate them? Personal rehabilitation initiatives in Chad, for example, saw more than 1,000 Chadians who were forcibly recruited into BH return for food rations. Yeah, sure, the government's rehabilitation attempts have been done incredibly poorly. They don't provide rehabilitated people with jobs or counseling, but that can always change. So if we know how to stop people from rejoining BH, then how do we stop them from joining it in the first place? Rehabilitation wouldn't be an option yet after all. But if the whole reason why people rejoin BH after being released from prison is because of their mistreatment in prison, then isn't the answer obvious? People join because they're being mistreated even before joining BH. It's because of violations of human rights, corruption, poverty, and other practices that are unconstitutional. Factionalized political elites who don't want to temporarily ignore their struggle for power to do anything about BH. Competition for resources around Lake Chad, with Chad, Cameroon, and Niger acting as refuge for radical Nigerians because of their indifference. No infrastructure, no education, and no employment, especially among young people. Groups like these proliferate because they provide young people with things that the state never did. Food, shelter, purpose. So that's why the cause of BH's existence, whether it's religious reasons or injustice, doesn't really matter to me. You could say it's religious because northern Muslims want religious self-determination because they think Sharia law would get them out of corruption, or you could say that rehabilitation is lackluster, making people want to return to BH, or you could say it's because northerners and southerners were already divided before the conflict began, or you could say that the north didn't receive enough socio-economic resources. Whatever reason people might have for joining BH, those are all effects of government neglect. Religion is also not the cause, but the rallying cry. Ethnic differences are not the cause of ethnic conflicts in Africa. African countries took over the colonial institutions that were meant to keep them divided, so that they could be easier to rule, and kept applying it after independence. Their leaders tried to keep power to themselves by ethnically stacking institutions, bargaining with certain ethnic groups to vote for them, and excluding migrants or those who are perceived as migrants. Not giving other groups cultural autonomy makes them see secession as a preferable alternative. And those conflicts are artificially prolonged due to outside interference by other African countries or due to international interests. Linguistic differences are not the cause of linguistic conflicts in Africa. African countries place emphasis on international languages in their education policies. Native languages are seen as unimportant in comparison, being relegated to being taught by parents, and thus not obtaining the standardization or glossaries it needs to be of any importance to education or the scientific community, so they don't get developed more. Governments try to promote unity by only promoting one language, ignoring the advantages of bilingualism in the process. Religious differences are not the cause of religious conflicts in Africa. Governments who can't make up their mind over how to interpret religious laws leads to marginalization of minority groups under the preface of being inclusive. Different groups never being able to compromise on certain issues creates mistrust between them. Certain regions don't have the institutions to keep them afloat, and aren't given any religious autonomy, which very religious people like those in Africa might value. It results in radical groups filling the gaps, either to give them security or to give them religious autonomy. And that's why creating a map like this wouldn't solve anything. Ignoring the initial problem of the progress of certain successful African countries getting completely removed in the process, ethnic conflicts will still persist if the government keeps dividing them on purpose. Linguistic conflicts will still persist if native languages aren't valued as much as international ones. And religious conflicts will still persist if moderates and extremists can never make compromises. This map is not a solution, but it was never supposed to be. It was for fun. And despite its flaws, I hope you find it fun too. And that's basically the whole argument that this video is trying to make. If you could only take away one thing from this video, then that would be it. Now, all that remains is to hope that I didn't royally mess up the difference between correlation and causality. But I already know what you might say. Well, smarty pants, if you think that ethnic, linguistic, or religious differences aren't what leads to conflict, then why not just make the borders this? A fully united Africa without borders. And hey, that's a good question, and I agree that removing the restrictions that borders bring is a good thing. But there's already something similar to this, which I've referenced a couple times in this video, the African Union. Sure, the borders still exist, it's not a completely united thing, but it'd be good to take a look at the AU first to see if a completely united Africa would even be feasible. So, is the African Union effective? Yeah, I don't know what else I was expecting with such a long build-up. I like the European Union. It's had its ups and downs, but I think that, in general, it has improved the lives of the people within the member state countries. So I also wanted the African Union to be successful, but from what I've read, I just cannot come to that conclusion, unfortunately. But before I get ahead of myself, let's clear some basic stuff up first. What is the African Union? Before the African Union, you had the Organization of African Unity, made in 1963 with the goal of promoting African unity and cooperation and to end colonialism. But the OAU faced many problems. No good institutions, no good leadership, financial, logistical, and political problems, and most of all, it couldn't actually interfere in its own member states, so it couldn't prevent or manage conflicts. So in 2002, the OAU became the African Union to fix those issues, with Article 4H of the Constitutive Act allowing the AU to intervene in member states if they're acting out of line. Of course, it has various institutions to address all of those other problems. The Assembly has each head of state, and makes decisions on policy with consensus or a 2/3 majority, meeting once a year. The Executive Council does foreign affairs. The Pan-African Parliament represents the people and gives advice. It also has a Court of Justice and a Peace and Security Council. And the AU has definitely had some successes, notably in handling coups, or UCGs as they call it. Sanctions against Sierra Leone, Togo, and Sudan, for example, were effective in delegitimizing coups. When Madagascar got couped in 2009, the AU intervened to resolve the crisis and to prepare Madagascar for future governance. The AU sanctions are both punishing, but offer room for reconciliation, and they try to get the country back on track like it was before. Hellquist likens AU sanctions to peer reviews, like those in academic articles. Aw, rats. Optimism time is over. I have to start complaining more. So, in 2015, the AU Peace and Security Council demanded that Burundi allow an AU peace force in the country to solve Burundi's domestic crisis, trying to enact Article 4H, which we talked about earlier. And, Burundi said no. And there lies the AU's biggest problem. It can't really do anything if the member states don't care. Burundi was later able to extend the amount of term limits its president could have, and the East African community didn't want to do anything about it because they themselves tend to do that as well. The AU absolutely wants to take action, but without the approval of the member states, it's as if it's still shackled to the OAU's rules. The Peace and Security Council, or PSC, doesn't have any rules that state what it's supposed to do if a member state isn't compliant. Instead, it's the Assembly that's supposed to ensure compliance, but it's not clear either what the Assembly can even do about it. The PSC also has the Continental Early Warning System, which is supposed to warn the PSC of stuff going south in member states, so that it can intervene before anything major happens. That's cool and all, but even if the PSC is warned in time, action still needs to be taken, which is often hard because the Assembly once again has the final say, and the Assembly works on a 2/3 majority and meets just once a year. It's slow as molasses, which is also why it's not good at ensuring compliance. All of the AU's institutions are riddled with structural problems. The Court of Justice can't submit cases against states who don't accept its jurisdiction, the African Standby Force lacks good equipment, the PSC lacks human resources, and is over-politicized for the job it's trying to do. And the Pan-African Parliament is ignored because its decisions aren't binding. Hits close to home. Besides the institutions, and considering the Burundi example mentioned earlier, the AU also quarrels a lot with its own members. The AU has regional economic communities, or RECs, and regional mechanisms for conflict prevention, or RMs, because their proximity to conflicts means that they'd be more effective to deal with security issues. But none of their laws state that the AU is a leader in peace and security issues. So the functions of these groups and the AU often overlap. In Mali, for example, the AU and ECOWAS both tried to take the lead in the Mali crisis, and as a result didn't distribute the work properly. That's on top of Mali being non-compliant, and Chadian and French troops initially acting without either ECOWAS or the AU's approval. Some RECs and RMs are also just better or worse than others. ECOWAS is pretty effective, but the East African IGAD members, who are supposed to be mediators, like getting involved in conflicts in their region for their own gain. The AU and IGAD sent separate envoys to South Sudan, which is a waste of resources. And the IGAD continuously blocked any attempts by the AU to punish South Sudanese elites who didn't adhere to the 2015 peace deal. Neutrality seems to be hard to maintain when a country is so close to the conflict that's taking place. And on top of ineffective institutions and disagreements with the regions, let's also just add international beef on top of it. The AU sees the International Criminal Court as an untrustworthy institution that interferes in Africa's interests, because it most often convicts Africans, and so the AU wants to undermine the ICC's influence. Now, I don't really know enough about this topic to fairly judge if the ICC is focused on Africa or not. It's just that this creates another problem for the AU, because some of its member states still accept the ICC's jurisdiction, while some only abide by the African Court on Human and People's Rights. Some both, some neither. It's kind of a mess. Besides the Continental Early Warning System, the AU also often ignores early warning signs by the UN and the International Crisis Group, like the ones given for the Tigray War. Sure, the AU's international policy hasn't been entirely bad. Their joint intervention with the European Union in 2013 in the Central African Republic was pretty effective due to actually working together very well. But that also reveals a bigger problem of the AU unfortunately having to rely on the EU or other external partners a lot. It doesn't have the resources to fund its own peace operations and requires foreign technical and financial aid, slowing down their reaction time even more. External actors provided about 56% of the AU's budget for programs and operations in 2013, a whopping 96.7% for just programs. Routinely having to rely on external funding provides the risk that peace operations can fall through if those funds are withdrawn. The AU's mission in Somalia, for example, was demoralized by the EU delaying funds or using those funds elsewhere. The AU would love to be able to provide peace, but it lacks logistical support and money, which is something that countries have. But those countries who can provide what the AU needs often won't cooperate because they don't want to give up some of their sovereignty, or just because they're not democratic, or because of a lack of trust. For example, why would Congolese people trust the AU after its history with other African states? Angola and Congo-Brazzaville expelled its citizens, Uganda, Rwanda and Zimbabwe stole its natural resources, South African treaties heavily weakened the DRC, and there were many attempts by its neighbors to interfere during the Second Congo War. Member states also often don't ratify AU treaties due to the sovereignty, democracy and trust issues. The Data Protection Convention, for example, wants to protect data privacy, since Africa has a high amount of surveillance and data mining. But the convention doesn't have enough ratifications to come into force. The PSC also faces problems of AU member states not ratifying its human rights treaties. Same thing with gender equality and women's rights treaties. I don't mean to be a hater, cause you can see that the African Union puts a lot of effort into developing Africa. But its slow institutions, lack of synergy with its regions, reliance on international aid, and member states that fall asleep at the wheel make its job a lot more difficult than the EU's. And when the African Union was founded, these problems were at their worst. I skipped talking about the Darfur peace process in the mid-2000s back in 1.3, but that's because knowing the shortcomings of the AU first is very helpful in order to understand what went wrong here. In 2004, the AU sent peacekeeping forces to Darfur to end the crimes against humanity there, but they failed. Then they tried again in 2005, but they failed again. That's largely due to poor capacity and a lack of resources. Third time's the charm though, and in 2007 the AU and the UN finally had their peacekeeping forces in Darfur, this time known as UNAMID. UNAMID was a joint intervention, where the AU and UN shared resources and followed the same plan. In 2005, the UN held a summit, giving states a responsibility to protect people in danger of crimes. So the UNAMID intervention in Darfur was one of the first tests of that doctrine. But before UNAMID could even be dispatched, a peace agreement for Darfur had to be signed first, which is what the Abuja negotiations in 2006 were for. But in their hurry to get UN troops on the field, they made way too many crucial mistakes. The Abuja negotiations tried to take the path of least resistance, trying to make the terms acceptable for all parties, and they did not want the discussion to get too complicated. Sudan took advantage of this reluctance by refusing to allow military advisors in the negotiations, which the AU accepted to not slow things down. Many of Darfur's armed groups also weren't there, because the AU assumed that the Sudanese government would represent them well enough, which is definitely not the case. The AU and the United States also didn't verify the positions of the Janjaweed, or talk about how to disarm them, because apparently the AU forgot, and the parties who didn't sign the Darfur peace agreements were expelled. Organizing the UNAMID forces went so hastily that it became an enormous logistical challenge for the AU and the UN to coordinate, or to even know what they were supposed to do. So when there was a quick review mission in February 2007 before the real thing, it was only on the field for 12 days. Okay, granted, this wasn't just the AU's fault. The UN and the US are also to blame for allowing the Abuja negotiations to move so quickly. But the AU also insisted that this was an African problem with an African solution, allowing foreign powers like the US, the EU, Russia and China to sit back and tacitly defend their material interest in Sudan by not providing that much aid. Like Alex DeWaal said, it's a failure of the responsibility to protect. UNAMID became a peacekeeping force in which the differences between the AU and the UN were laid bare, and it performed poorly as a result. Obviously, that's not to discredit all the things that UNAMID accomplished, but I think it represents the struggles that the African Union has to face every time it wants to prevent horrible crimes from being committed. It's always held back by something. So, is that it? If the borders we currently have aren't good enough, if any redraw of the borders wouldn't be good enough, and if a fully united Africa wouldn't even be feasible right now, then what's the plan? Isn't there even a way to solve any of the problems we've discussed throughout this video? Yes. And actually, the solution is really damn simple. You know what all three of those scenarios have in common? It's the focus on borders. I mean, obviously, that's the thing this whole video is about. Well, you know what? We're like several hours into the video at this point. I can swear. Fuck borders. Something that should be common knowledge at this point, but something that even I have missed before, is that the current African borders weren't actually arbitrarily drawn during the Berlin Conference. Instead, the Berlin Conference had three goals: create a free trade zone around the Congo River, freedom of navigation on the Congo and Niger rivers, and discuss the formalities of occupying African coasts. It wasn't about discussing each empire's sovereignty, but to prevent conflict between them. And the best way to prevent conflict is through the principle of suzerainty, the right to control a territory. And how can you achieve that? Well, by holding a piece of paper that confirms it, of course. So European powers signed treaties with local rulers to confirm their suzerainty and thus prevent conflicts. To sign those treaties, they needed intelligence of the ground, and they needed to get to know the frontiers of pre-colonial states by interacting with Africans. So Europeans weren't completely oblivious to Africa's geography, and Africans also had a small amount of agency in deciding the borders, though the treaties were often misleading. The borders between empires weren't decided in Berlin either. Those were based on many different bilateral agreements made before and after the conference. Because of the knowledge Europeans gained of the terrain, many of these borders were based on pre-colonial divisions that already existed, especially if their leaders were loyal to the colonizers. Really, the only borders that were settled in Berlin were those of the Free Congo state, but even those changed along the way. Hell, even those awful straight borders were drawn strategically, specifically in places where not many people live and there aren't many geographical features, like in deserts. That's also to prevent conflict between European powers. I think the article by Payne, Chiu and Ricard Huget says it the best. The overwhelming focus in the literature on borders misunderstands why the broader process of externally imposed state formation was harmful. It's silly to reduce the causes of Africa's conflicts to their borders suck. Because while they do have the legitimacy of international law on their side, ordinary people pass over them all the time. The borders are way too long and the terrain thereon was way too hostile for European colonials to police. So you can bet the current African states can't police them either. To take from Emery Rowe once again, blaming Africa's issues on its borders is a narrative. One that may be somewhat grounded in reality, but one that does not help make effective policies. Border specialists should instead highlight the cooperative potential that borders have, because there are more zones of interaction than lines of partition. And that's why I'm saying that the borders don't actually matter. Like, yeah, they're not good, but they're fine for what they are. To actually solve problems that Africa faces today, we need to look past its borders, and talk about other ways to solve those problems that doesn't involve changing the borders. And hey, why don't we do that right now? The African Union is obviously not completely blind to its shortcomings. It's been working on improving itself, and the results have been pretty good so far. In 2013, the AU adopted the Agenda 2063, a 50-year plan with 7 aspirations and 20 goals to improve Africa on basically all fronts. It aims to set up a free trade area between African countries, a high-speed train network, and even a space agency. A good amount of progress has already been made, although many of those projects are unfortunately held back by a lack of funding. That part seems to always return, huh? But it is still a good idea to reduce trade tariffs and build infrastructure, since high transportation costs drain a lot of Africa's wealth from the get-go. But leaving aside the financial issues, there are also ways in which the AU can solve some of its more specific problems that we talked about. To prevent the RECs from being uncooperative, the individual states need to give the AU more power to intervene in conflicts. It needs to set the norms that the RECs follow. In Darfur, the AU and the UN shouldn't have imposed their will forcefully by using weapons. Instead, arms control of the armed groups in Darfur needed to be consensual, and people who owned weapons needed to be answerable to some authority. That's something to keep in mind for future peace operations. But those peacekeeping troops also need to have proper logistical support to be able to implement a ceasefire. It's also important to not hesitate to call something a geno when it's a geno, because it lets the perpetrators know that they can be tried by the ICC, and it also causes the AU's Article 4H to activate. Another way to prevent conflicts is to have the AU create a group identity that African states would want to be included in, which would allow the AU to delegitimize states that fall out of line like Sudan. But one common group identity probably wouldn't be enough. It's also important for the individual African countries to create their own identity. The advantage of having one overarching identity is that interactions between different groups are more friendly. But the advantage of having separate identities is that the different groups can work together, but on different things. And as long as they're on equal status, they believe the other group's presence is beneficial. So if both of those identity models are good, then why not combine the two? The dual identification model recognizes both the common group and the subgroup, allowing people to perceive each other as members of the common group, while also not feeling like their personal identity is threatened, because they can still identify with their subgroup. I mean, why do you think divide and conquer was such a good strategy for Europeans? If they hammer down on everyone, then that just gives them a common group identity for free, on top of their already existing subgroups. Only repressing some groups prevents that. And because of that, some minority identities are still contested by people who think they aren't part of their group. They deny those people their dual identity, preventing the group's integration. Remember this Afrobarometer graph I showed you at the start of the video? Well, you can see that in the 32-country average, the largest portion of people feel equally like their national identity and their ethnic identity. So I'd say implementing this model makes a lot of sense. One country who has adopted the dual identity model to great effect is Botswana. It makes sense that it's often seen as one of the most successful countries in Africa. Botswana has tried to avoid inequalities between its various ethnic groups by giving everyone equal access to education. But it has also tried to create a national identity by having government services be available almost everywhere in the country. Botswana's school curriculum encourages people to be tolerant towards other ethnic groups, but also recategorizes them into one inclusive identity. South Africa, on the other hand, has a pluralist approach. It's meant to make ethnic identities important, while encouraging good relations between them. And indeed, South Africa has a much larger portion of people who only feel like their ethnic identity than Botswana. It's also a good model to consider, although we did already go over some of its flaws in 2.3. But of course, Botswana's recategorization model also has some flaws. Their education system forcing students to speak Setswana and English, just to foster that national identity, makes smaller ethnic groups feel discriminated against for sure. Another downside of the dual identity model in general is that it's hard to bring in a third identity. For example, in Western Europe there are a lot of Turkish families who already have to maintain their Turkish subgroup and the common group of the country they live in, which makes it difficult for them to identify with their religion, especially in some areas with high amounts of discrimination against Muslims. But that's more so our fault, because obtaining that third identity is a lot more easy if it isn't discriminated against. All in all, the dual identity model is a pretty good way to prevent conflicts between groups. If Botswana were to offer education in minority languages in the future, then that would be ideal. But as we discussed in Chapter 2, students don't always see the benefit of using African languages in education, and instead prefer an international one like English or French. That's why it's necessary to show students how African languages can be helpful, like in employment for example. That would entail education systems becoming bilingual, or making some native languages official languages, preserving African languages by using dictionaries, translation machines, or refined orthographies, commissioning researchers in order to see what should be done to improve the education system. You get the idea. Because students dropping out of school early due to not understanding the language of instruction is one of the causes of illiteracy and poverty. Same goes for religion. Diversity is key. Of course, states can't manufacture religious diversity as easily as linguistic diversity. It's something a lot more personal. But states can still pass laws that make it easier for different religions to live in the same area. Absolutely do not frame other religions as potential threats, since that makes violence more acceptable in people's eyes. Taking Ethiopia as an example again, the thought that its federal borders dictate the home of certain ethnic groups should leave, because there will always be other groups in those areas who often aren't protected against violence because of a lack of institutions. Ethiopia and Oromia also need to stop seeing each other as existential threats to each other, because they're really not. As long as both sides make concessions, with Oromia mainly focusing on socio-economic and human rights demands, and with Ethiopia not being incredibly reactionary, they can escape their cycle of crises. It might be a bit late for Somalia to implement stuff like that though. They instead need to focus on cutting off support to Al-Shabaab, which they can do by offering the Somali youth a community through sports or peace training programs, because otherwise they'll find their community in a radical group. Don't make the same mistake as the AU in Darfur of excluding many armed groups, because then their problems aren't addressed, making it difficult to actually solve the root of the conflict. One country that I think did something pretty cool in their post-war peace process is Liberia. I think that way because they basically did the exact opposite of what Rwanda did after their Geno, which oversimplified the narrative and manipulated people's memories by creating a single Banyarwanda ethnicity to sweep its divisions under the rug. What Liberia did after their civil wars is create a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which wants to prevent unfiltered memories of the wars to get passed down, because it would only lead to new ethnic divisions. It recommends wartime memorials, like a holiday, to mourn, rebuilding sacred places, graves for those who didn't receive proper burials, public apologies by the Liberian state, and so on. Unfortunately, the main issue with it is that its recommendations haven't been implemented very well, but if they were, they would be a great help in allowing Liberians to move on from the conflicts peacefully. You could say that South Sudan changed the culture of secessionism, since it's the first African secession to not be based on a former colonial boundary, opening up the possibilities for other future African countries. And hey, this'll probably continue in the future. Not necessarily countries seceding, that might happen, but that's kind of hard to predict right now. No, what I mean is that it's now Africa's turn to decide what happens with its borders, without interference from any colonial power. Its states need to settle their own disputes, with their own strategic policies and their own regional cooperations. And they have been. Since 2007, the AU has had a border program to demarcate some of the more vague borders and encourage cross-border cooperation. And I think they're completely right when they say that borders are not barriers, but bridges. With all of this in mind, I'm very optimistic about what the future holds for Africa's borders. Oh, that's great! Drat, they totally ruined my perfect ending. Okay, let me see how to quickly do another one. Always end your book with Nelson Mandela saying something about rainbows or renaissances. Oh, rainbows, yes! Happy Pride Month, baby! Hey, it's been a while since I've sat in this very obviously traced chair. Let's fix that real quick. There we go, much better. Let's have a nice talk. So by all means, this is the end of the video, and from this point forward I'm going to be rambling about some additional stuff. So if you don't care about any of that, then you can leave, and that's perfectly fine. Thank you for watching all the way through. Remember to subscribe on the way out, yada yada. Alright, if you're still here, let me first say, sorry this video took so long to come out. I'm not really someone who is on that YouTube grind set, I'm on that snooze set. I love sleeping and my mental health, yippee! But another reason why it took so long is because I was often very worried about the things I was writing. I am not African, I am a European who is in a privileged position, allowing me to even make a video like this. And that's why throughout the writing process I was always anxious about if what I wrote was actually correct or if I would upset anyone. And if I did, then I'm really sorry. My critiques weren't directed at you specifically, but at the government of your country. I don't know anything, I simply agree with what people who are smarter than me are saying. But to make sure that what I was saying was accurate, I contacted some professors who wrote some of the books I cited, as well as some professors from my own university. I won't disclose who they are here because I didn't ask them if I could, and they probably expected that I was contacting them for like an academic paper, like a normal person, instead of a YouTube video essay. What I will say though is that one of them linked me to an article in the magazine Granta written by Binyavanga Wainaina called How to Write About Africa. And dude, if you ever want to write about Africa, then this article should be your starting point. And I wish it was my starting point. It is a very satirical text about the most egregious stereotypes in writings about Africa. Very funny. Even if you won't write about Africa, you'll want to read it since you've come this far. It's linked in the Bibliography Google Doc in the description. It definitely made me feel better about myself because at least I did try avoiding all of those stereotypes. Binyavanga Wainaina unfortunately passed away in 2019, but he wrote a book in 2011 titled One Day I Will Write About This Place, which is his memoir about his life in Kenya. I bought it, or at least the Dutch translation of it, because it was cheaper. Like dude, €8 for a hardcover? Yes please. I haven't finished it yet, and I don't think I fully understand it quite yet, but I'm gonna just read some more to find that out. And it is definitely fun to read. If anyone happens to have the book on hand, page 54 piqued my interest because it talks about children who can't escape their tribe, which is not speaking English or Kiswahili, are often the subjects of mockery. That kind of reminded me of the Tanzania chapter in this video, though keep in mind that the events in Wainaina's book take place, like, before 2000 something. Speaking of the Tanzania chapter, god that's such a good segue, one of the writers I cited a lot there was Elliot Green. I got the whole dispersed population concept from him. He sometimes posts stuff on his personal blog, and my eyes fell on one post called Israel, a 19th century state in a 21st century world. Now, I don't bring this up just to diss Israel. Don't worry, I'll diss Israel plenty when I make the retrospective of this year's Eurovision. Cause wow, that sucked. But anyways, in that post, Green mostly talks about how African nation-states work, and that them being diverse doesn't ruin their potential growth. And specifically, he brings up how Rwanda's attempts to make itself ethnically homogenous is what led to violence. And also that Mauritius is a pretty successful middle-income country, despite it being multiracial. Those are literally the first 2 chapters of this video, and I had already finished editing those before I knew about this blog post. So finding that stuff out on my own made me pretty proud of myself, and did push me to release this video even more. Another book I bought is called Colonial Congo, A History in Questions. In the end, I only cited it once, but as a Belgian, it's pretty important that I know about our own colonial history anyway. Pretty good book. Very easy to read because it's split up into chapters that are only about 10 pages long each. And yeah, that's all I had to say in this discussion. So if you have any more to say, then please do so. Like I said before, I have not experienced what Africans have, so your story is as valuable as mine. Looking back at my second video, it did basically kickstart this channel, which I'm very grateful for. And honestly, the like to dislike ratio ain't even that bad. I think it's just that the occasional comment calling me stupid gets under my skin a little. It's like when people comment under the Every Flag Explained video telling me that the red on their flag actually stands for the blood they spilled for independence. Like yeah, very cool buddy, but I'm not talking about flag symbolism, I'm talking about flag origins, which I clearly explained in this part of the video that I suggested you skip past at the start of the video because I am a dumbass. Where's my coffee? I need my coffee. Bye.